Welcome back to Give Up After 3, a critical analysis of BBC Sherlock, examining each episode to understand how things went so wrong that fans invented a secret final episode to justify why the show had been bad all along. You can find show notes and sources at zeroindent.com/giveupafter3. And if you want episodes early, head over to patreon.com/zeroindent to support us. You could be listening to the whole of Season 3 right now. I'm DC McNeil, author and editor-in-chief at Zero Indent, and I'm joined, as always, by YouTuber Darth. Darth, what's up, man?
Hey, how you doing?
Listen, let me tell you how I'm doing. I was really worried about this season of the show, and let's just say that those fears were not allayed by this episode. Welcome back to Season 3. Today we're going to be talking about Season 3, Episode 1, The Empty Hearse. This one was directed by Jeremy Lovering. It was written by the one true Mark Gatiss. It originally aired the 1st of January 2014. It opened to 12.72 million UK viewers. And this episode contains like the last episode, contains mild but frequent topics of suicide and depression. And this one's adapted pretty loosely on the adventure of the empty house and the Lost special as well. Before we get into the summary, Darth, talk to me about the premiere of Season 3. What did you think?
I loved it when I first saw it. I want to say that I'm not nearly as angry at it as you are.
I wouldn't say angry so much as personally attacked by it.
It definitely has its flaws, but it hits enough of the right beats that I still found it extremely entertaining. And I don't know. I think a part of that is just the way that the three main characters interact, and now we're introducing John's fiance as another main character. And under the synergy that they all have just kind of works for me. So it's a lot easier to. I mean, even just with John and Sherlock, it's easier to overlook all of the weak points of the story and everything, and then adding something else into that just even is like further. Don't look at the other stuff, just focus on the characters and the good stuff we're doing. There was lots of little things, like I'm noticing way more now when he just does a solve, and I'm like, there's no way that's magic. There's nothing there that you could have done.
Yeah. I will say I'm with you. I think the addition of Mary and her chemistry, like, what a great, just all around, what a great sort of dynamic this ends up creating. Moffat, for the first time, writes a pretty compelling, rounded female character, and then will pretty quickly get rid of her. So that's exciting for us. I'll be honest. So I've talked about this before. My process for the show is I watch the whole episode end to end and jot down notes, and then I watch it again and I'll pause and take notes and pay particular attention and try and pull things apart. It took me 4 goes to watch it the first time. I got like 15 minutes in and got bored and then walked away and did something else and then came back and sat down and then watched 5 minutes and then was like, oh no, I'll go work on book 3. And I was like, oh, actually, I might go edit this other side project I'm working. I just kept, and eventually I was like, just sit down. I was like, just put a beer in front of you, sit down and just press play and just leave it playing. And that was the only way I got through it the first time. So I had
That's when you know it's quality, when you got to get inebriated in order to enjoy it.
I had real trouble with this one. This is really starting to worry me for the rest of the series, because like we still have pretty much like this full season. We have 3 episodes left in this season because we have the special, and then we have a full season left after this. I'm really worried about getting through it now, because I thought in my head, I was like, it'll be fine. I've really enjoyed it so far. This one, I really struggle with. I'll talk a little bit about why. I still had a good time. I liked elements of it. But it's really starting to, I'm not even getting irritated at it anymore. It's just boring me to tears. And that's not a great sign. But look, there are really good parts of it. As you said, the Mary stuff, I think, really need inclusion. The other stuff around Anderson and Molly we'll kind of get to, and what all is going on there at a formal level. But I'll get us through the summary, and then we can start to sort of settle in. I guess as a bit of a sizzle, as I've started doing. Some of the big topics I'm going to cover this week will be death of the author and conspiracy theorists. So put on your French contemporary literary hats, folks, because we're going to be talking about Barthes. We're going to be talking a little bit about Madame Bovary. And then, as always, we'll be covering a bit about what all is going on Tumblr and where the metas have got to. And I guess, like, probably most crucially, given the way that this happens in time, is that this bridge between season 2 and 3 is like this is when it's going crazy online. Like, this is where we're starting to see the huge explosion of, this is no longer just a few blogs, this is now like one of the 3 main fandoms on Tumblr. And that has a certain effect on the kind of content. It has an effect on the way people are talking about the show, and it ends up kind of changing what the show is about in sort of reaction to that, which we actually see in this episode. So without further ado, summary. So 2 years after he faked his death, Holmes's name has been completely cleared of all wrongdoings in regards to Moriarty. With Mycroft's assistance, Holmes returns to London in secret. Meanwhile, Anderson continues to go off the deep end, pitching Lestrade increasingly ridiculous methods of Holmes' survival in an effort to alleviate his guilt. Watson, having put his life back together, is now seeing Mary Morstan and is planning to propose during an expensive dinner. Holmes disguises himself as a waiter to get Watson's attention. Watson, struggling to accept Holmes' explanation for his survival, punches him multiple times. Watson, angry with Holmes, correctly refuses to work with him. Consequently, Holmes brings Molly along as an assistant on his next case, an underground skeleton behind a desk containing a manuscript, How I Did It by Jack the Ripper. Later that day, Mary receives a text message in skip code declaring that Watson has been kidnapped and will die if not rescued in time. Holmes and Mary rescue Watson from a bonfire beneath a Guy Fawkes effigy. Through coincidence, Holmes deduces that a train carriage disappeared below the House of Parliament and concludes an attack is imminent, correlating to a new anti-terrorist bill being heard on Guy Fawkes Night, 5th of November. Watson and Holmes discover the abandoned train car, and Holmes manages to defuse the bomb. We then cut to Holmes visiting Anderson, revealing how he faked his death. Holmes tells Anderson that he and Mycroft had anticipated 13 possible scenarios that could happen on the roof, and that while Watson's view was obstructed, members of his homeless network rolled out an inflatable mattress and took their roles as shocked bystanders and paramedics. With the aid of a squash ball on his arm to temporarily stop his pulse, Holmes convincingly faked his death. Anderson is doubtful of the explanation and questions Holmes as he turns around and finds the room empty, laughing and presumably talking to himself. Moran? Wow, it sounds weird in an Australian accent. Moran, the lord responsible for the train carriage bomb, is arrested. Watson asks Holmes who abducted him, but Holmes does not know. In a tag, we see a man with blue eyes and glasses watching footage of Watson's rescue from the fire. Credits. I skipped some stuff, but really not a lot happens in this episode as the kind of net of what that summary looks like. Let's, I guess, get started with the kind of first scene. So we actually open with Sherlock on the rooftop of St. Bart's and John on the pavement below. This is something that I want to make really explicit, and I'll talk about it when we get to the explanation, is that this episode goes out of its way to avoid explaining exactly how Sherlock survived, which I don't think on paper that's a bad thing. But I just want to point out that whenever we cut away to these are invariably not the explanation. These are someone pitching an explanation of what happened. So, as Sherlock speaks to John over the phone, Moriarty's body is dragged away and his face is covered with a mask of Sherlock's face. Sherlock falls off the roof, and as John is looking up, he is hit by a cyclist. Jesus Christ, David. Just write cyclist. Molly Hooper is shown looking out the window when this happens and looks surprised when she sees Sherlock go past it. He's then on a bungee rope which bounces him back up before he can hit the ground. He crashes through the window to meet Molly and kisses her and walks away. Meanwhile, on the ground, Moriarty's body is dragged onto the pavement and decorated with fake blood. As John stands up slowly, Darren Brown intervenes by hypnotizing John, convincing him to sleep for a short time, and gives the people with Moriarty's corpse more time. We then cut to Lestrade, who reveals it's just a theory, and Anderson is pitching it. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Talk to me about this opening scene, Darth. What do you think? What do we think of this version of the kind of heroic, romantic Sherlock with the face replacement?
it was very Mission Impossible, so it was
Yeah.
not unentertaining, and even the way that they kind of spliced everything together kind of had that feel to me. Um, there was one British moment or stupid
I've
American British moment.
I've written down. Does Darth know who Darren Brown is?
Zero clue. And honestly, I never really, yeah. And Lestrade, he in confusion, he looks at Anderson and says Darren Brown, and in my mind, I'm like, did he just curse at him? I literally don't know what words he said,
so
and I
funny.
never actually stopped to look it up in the past like 10 years that I've been watching the show off and on.
Yeah, no,
So then I
that's
had to
good.
actually Google who Darren Brown was and find out that, oh, this isn't made up. Like he actually like does this for a career, whether it's made up or not, I don't care. But the point is that it could have been theoretically legit that Sherlock got a world class psychic or whatever he does in order to help him with his thing.
Yes.
So that was both cool, but and I could see why Lestrade reacted that way, even though I didn't understand it for the past decade. But
It's
hey.
Derek Brown is like the UK's version of Chris Angel, I guess. That's the best way
Okay.
to describe that. Except Chris Angel's kind of hacky and weird, and Darren Brown is classy and weird. Yeah, basically. So this whole thing is Anderson pitching a theory to Lestrade. The two are in front of this coffee stand, watching reporters who then reveal that Sherlock's innocence has been proven, even though it's obviously too late because he's dead. Lestrade is obviously not convinced by Anderson's theories, saying that they're only based on guilt, which is sort of pretty obvious here. I like the line from Lestrade, which is, quote, "You did this, and you killed him, and he's staying dead." I really like it.
Yeah.
We get a scene of John at Sherlock's grave, which adds nothing to the show. I think they just needed to fill time. There's a few scenes in this where, like, doesn't contribute anything, and it's clear they need to get to that 1 hour 30 runtime. And I think there's a few little cutaways here where they're just piling in seconds through like coverage they've clearly shot just in case. I guess the idea
Well,
is
I might argue that that scene could be seen as needed because that's the introduction to Mary. It shows that possibly they're either already married or at the very least dating long enough that he would take someone like that to the graveside of his best friend. So long-term relationship is what we're inferring from this.
that's fair. I guess if I was putting my editing hat on, I would be like, that's fine, and that's a valid argument for including it. However, the very next introduction we get of her provides us enough context that we know he's going to propose. So like he goes to Baker Street and he's telling Mrs. Hudson, "Hey, I'm going to propose." Like we get that as explicit text. So yeah, I don't mind it. I just think I'm going to call out a few scenes like that where you go, this doesn't add enough to justify it needing to be here, but also it's not a crime that it's here. I just think it's
I was just scrolling through to confirm the very next scene that we see her in, and it is at the restaurant. And you could say that that is a decent enough way to introduce her character because there's this grandiose shot of her kind of coming down the stairs. And it could be set up enough that I would say that cutting that opening graveyard scene would be fine. It also might, though, give us a hint at John.
Yeah.
But we also don't need that because I was thinking to give us a hint of his thoughts towards Sherlock, and the fact that he's still grieving shows that he still has that relationship and wants that relationship. But we get that same thing with Mrs. Hudson in the next scene. So I'm reversing my argument. I could see why they might keep it, but now I agree with you, and I think probably cutting it, you could.
I think it just makes things a little bit less noisy, I guess. But you know, I think it's just a symptom of this is becoming like a TV show now instead of this experiment in we'll get there. What do you think about Anderson here? Obviously they've done the Hollywood thing where he's grown his hair and a beard, and that's how you can tell that he's a bit crazy.
This is our indicator to the
Yes.
world that we are mentally unstable.
The length indicates the
Yes.
lack of mental stability.
But I also love I love that they made it so that there were consequences, and a whole lot of the time you don't see people that play those roles. Where he was like the devil on the cops, the big cop's shoulder, and that was his role, was to play that little voice in his ear, and you almost never see like really long-term consequences for those kind of secondary characters or
Yep.
even tertiary, whatever we want to call them. So I really like that they did that, and that we see that he it looks like his entire personality changed, because he was always a complete and utter douche,
Yep.
always, but now he's like on the verge of likable. It may be crazy,
Yeah, it's
but
interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah.
There's something here about whether or not, and I haven't really written too much on this, but whether or not Sherlock is like a moral universe. For those who sort of don't have many degrees in like creative writing, when we talk about the idea of a moral universe, it's this notion of, so like there are stories where if you do bad things, there will be consequences and bad things will happen to you. And if you do good things will happen to you, and like there'll be knock-on benefits of that. That's probably the kind of universe we would have seen like in the 70s and 80s mostly, where that sort of thing was pretty normal. I think in much more contemporary settings, we're a lot more interested in kind of morally ambiguous universes, or universes where like morals are less secular than that. It's very much like a holdover from like your sort of Judeo religious artifacting in the kind of creative writing space. You obviously see that with Tolkien, which is a very moral, kind of moralistic universe. I'm wondering more and more like whether or not Sherlock is even interested in that stuff. We kind of saw it in season 1 a little bit, but then it's sort of just fallen away to be like, smart people are good, and then these side players just kind of exist to talk about how good the smart people are, because that's really like Anderson's role here, is to kind of valorize Holmes, and that Holmes was so important to this person that his death has completely changed him is kind of interesting. But yeah, I might keep an eye on that, because I think we're going to see a little bit more of that toward the end of this season. Cool. Do you have anything else before we talk about Serbia?
There was another beautiful transition that was also one of the weirdest that we've seen, is both of the cops bring up their coffee cup, and it kind of goes into a freeze frame, and the coffee cups transition into the pupil of John's eyes. I love that transition. That just stuck with me really, really hard. I don't know why, because it's kind of weird when you go back and look at it, like artistically look at it, as a filmmaker, but it was also just such a unique idea, and I'm like, who was thinking about that when they wrote the scene? Because whoever wrote the scene was thinking from the cameraman's point of view, was how are we going to transition? And they're like, let's use his eyeballs.
There's quite a bit of that in this episode. Like, it's when we get to season 4, episode 1, that is like the best one for transitions, like just the most creative episode they've ever done. But you can start to feel them doing weirder stuff, and I kind of love it.
Yeah, I guess the interesting thing would be to try to figure out, from the cinematographer's point of view, is like, what is a good transition, what is a creative transition, but also what is too much. Where is the line?
Where's the line?
Yeah, because it should not be something the audience picks up on, I would assume.
I think it depends. I don't know. Because this episode has some goofy shit in it, like as far as the wishy VFX. But then also, like last episode we talked about, there was some goofy VFX in that I was like, oh, I didn't mind it. And you were like, they're just doing Iron Man. And so I think the line is like, it's really weird. I think it just has to have a purpose, and that purpose has to feel like it is justified within whatever's happening. Like when we get to some of the transitions later in the season, they're going to be transitioning between mind palaces and reality. And the transitions are necessary for us to understand what's happening in the show, versus like understanding or like some kind of emotion or momentum being conveyed, right? Like they're talking about Sherlock's innocence. We then cut to John's eyes because he's now thinking about Sherlock, right? Like, I don't know, there's like, it's like, how are you interpreting the stimulus in front of you? Like, what's the intention? And then what's the, like, how is it conceived by the audience and received? So I don't know. I don't really have a good answer. I think by season 4, like that there's a tipping point. Like season 4, episode 1 is great. And then it completely jumps the shark. And that's where I think it'll be interesting to talk about what's different about how they're using it. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So Serbia.
Serbia. So meanwhile, somewhere in Serbia, a man with long, scraggly hair is being pursued. We get some night vision camera shots, and it shows he's being trapped by three other men, and he's captured. Later, the long-haired man is chained with his arms outstretched and is being hit by an interrogator. There's another man sitting quietly in the room as well, a member of the jailer's group. The interrogator asks why the man broke into the area, and the prisoner replies with a series of facts about the interrogator's personal life, concluding with the fact that his wife is sleeping with his next-door neighbor. The interrogator storms out, and the other man in the room is shown to be Mycroft Holmes, who walks up to the prisoner and tells him that a massive attack is imminent on London. The prisoner is then revealed to be Sherlock. I don't. This is where I was like, this scene is where I was like, oh yeah, okay. Like, I don't know why, but it just is the most Sherlock fucking thing ever. To be like, isn't it cool that he's able to, like, it's this imaginary of like, wouldn't it be cool if this smart guy was also tough and able to withstand interrogation with his big brain? And I'm like, no, it's just kind of boring to watch, I think. Yeah, I don't.
You could also argue that's supposed to be they're making a correlation with Moriarty, because all of the time that he was being tortured, he didn't care. He kept quiet until he was talking about Sherlock. I don't know if they went into that depth when they were writing this, that they were like, these guys are the same side of the different coin, or however you want to think about it, but I could see that we want to see him be able to withstand the same torture that Moriarty withstood. But aside from that, the solve in this, just like, I loved this scene. I love the idea of the solve, and I hate the solve. And the solve ruined all of the cinematography of how I loved how they shot this. But now that I'm thinking about it, the solve just hurts.
Yeah. Yeah, it completely...
There's some of it he could see. He could see the tattoos,
yes.
Right? So he knows some of the stuff. He could see the dude's fingernails, so that probably told him something. But the wife and the dude next door is a coffin maker. I mean...
It takes all of the tension out of the scene the second it happens, where it's like, oh, okay, we're just doing this now? All right. Like, you just go, oh, he's just making stuff up, okay. And so you stop paying attention to what's going. Like, I don't know. Like, there's something about it that the second that he starts to make that solve, you can't be, like, he's going to get out of it. There's no consequences anymore. I think is maybe the thing.
And this is what you were telling me about, like, when we very first started this, is that the creators think you're an idiot. And this is when it, like, really, 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 really hit me, was I used to love this solve. And I was like, I just don't see it. I'm not as smart as Sherlock. But now I'm looking at it, and I'm like, he can't see it either. He just magicked his way into it. It's not that he's smarter.
Yeah. He just has plot knowledge. There's a sequence we're going to get to in a little bit here where it's not just that they think that you're an idiot. It's that they think you're it's really complicated at a formal level. We'll talk about it when we talk about the conspiracy theorists. But there is something about the way this show conceives of people who are trying to solve these crimes, or people who are trying to follow Sherlock's logic. There is a way that it conceives of them as idiots who are missing the point. And this is, I think you're right. This is the first scene where, maybe that's why this is where, because like this is where I paused it and got up and did something else. Rye always talks about, is the point in the story where, like, you pick up a second screen. I always try and avoid doing that because I like to be focused, but like my thing is I'll pause it and get up and do something because I'm not engaged in that scene. And it wasn't until I got through Mycroft's office and we were back in London that I was then able to carry the momentum through. I think it's because the whole tension's gone. The second that solve happens, this is just like the scene with Mycroft is like a formal thing that has to happen. Sherlock has to come back, and it's sort of not paint by numbers. That's disingenuous. But I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like this next little sequence here happens because it has to happen, and there's nothing about it that's particularly interesting or dynamic or adds anything. Like it happens because it has to, because the previous thing happened.
Which you could almost argue in storytelling that that happens a lot, and sometimes there is just uninteresting stuff that has to be there to get from point A to point B, but they still probably could have done this in a different way. And one thing that really
Yeah.
bugged me about this scene was Mycroft, and his characterization is just flat out wrong. Like he like violently grabs Sherlock and like jerks his head back and starts whispering fervently in his ear. Like everything about him just is not the soft-spoken dude who doesn't want to get his, like, literally he says he doesn't like getting his hands dirty. And then he's over there like physically manhandling his brother. Like so much about the scene doesn't make sense, and it's like they just wanted that character to show up and be the one that rescued him. They wanted him, which it was really cool, him learning to speak Serbian
I like
just
that.
because, yeah, like I love that idea. It makes total sense if you know anything about languages and you've studied a little bit, but it's like they just wanted to show him off as being so smart that he could be the secret agent type person.
Yeah.
And I don't know that the entire scene really just it doesn't work the best as it could have.
Yeah, yeah. To your point about like, obviously fiction having to include certain things that are necessary, right? Like we've talked before about genre convention and things like that. You're not wrong. I think the writer's job is when you have to do those things, because like when we say have to, what we mean is that in certain stories, readers will have an expectation of certain conventions that need to occur for it to feel like that kind of story. In a murder mystery, the story has to start with a body or a crime. Like that's like the most obvious genre convention for that type of story. I think the trick, and I've talked about this before, the trick is if you have to do a scene that isn't particularly interesting, you need to find a way to make it either add tension or make it multi-purpose. So a really good way of doing it is if you have a sequence where it's like, okay, the detective, in this case, like the detective is being called to the case, right? You find a way to add some tension, like we saw in the first season, like episode 1, where it's like, Sherlock is texting them during a press conference, being like, you know where to find me, right? That's the same sequence done really creatively. It has the same effect on the story, which is Sherlock Holmes being called up to the plate, or Sherlock Holmes attaching himself to the case, however you want to think about these things. But the method that it does it is really interesting, and you start to go, well, who is this guy, and what does this all mean, and that sort of thing. This is just, they have a conversation about it, they're pretty amicable, and then we cut to the next sequence. Like, there's nothing here, and, Mycroft being like, oh, maybe John won't be that happy to see you. There's nothing here where you go like, we learned more about their relationship as brothers, or there's some tension between them, or, oh, there's something else happening here. Like, it's really just like I'll set up the sequence. So they're in Mycroft's office. Mycroft is reading a newspaper regarding something called the Skeleton Key mystery. Sherlock is being shaved and he's getting his hair cut. And then they quibble a bit about Mycroft getting Sherlock out of Serbia. And then Mycroft's like, hey, we need you back in London. But just, let me tell you that, like, don't be surprised if John doesn't want to see you. We then cut to John, who's coming to 221B for the first time in a long time, and explains to Mrs. Hudson that he's moving on with his life and he's going to propose to his girlfriend. John then has to insist that he's not gay after Mrs. Hudson implies multiple times that Sherlock was his boyfriend. And then we kind of cut to the restaurant. The note I've written here... My note here just says, okay, it's been 15 minutes and I'm bored. Which is really harsh, possibly, but like I was, because I was like, I just come the fuck on. Like, I don't know why this bit feels so tedious, but it really does. Like you said, I do want to say Mycroft learning Serbian in a few hours is really cool characterization. I love that he is still infinitely smarter than Sherlock in a way that is like, you understand why and how that might be. Like, it feels realistic in a sense, where Sherlock's intellect is sort of somewhere here, and then Mycroft's is so much further up that it doesn't feel out of character for him to be able to do incredible, miraculous things like this. And they don't require an explanation, because we have a benchmark of what we consider like our intelligent compared to normal people. And so he's so far superior that we actually don't, I think from a structural and a formal perspective, we don't necessarily need to know how he knows these things. What's important is that he does and that it's consistent. And I still enjoy that about him.
Yeah, I don't know if this is really the right place to interject this, but it just made me realize, and I think we had talked about this before, that there's not a good differentiation between the two of them and why he needs his brother in the first place to solve all these mysteries if Mycroft is supposed to be that much smarter.
Yeah.
And something that they could have written into there so easily is that as hard as it is for Sherlock to identify and understand people, identify with and understand people, Mycroft could be zero on that spectrum.
Yeah.
Like, he could be as brilliant as anything, but he doesn't understand why people wash their faces or something like that, where he can't physically do it, and that's why he needs his brother. As of right now, the only explanation we get is he doesn't like getting his hands dirty, he doesn't like the field work, and he wants his brother to be the lapdog that goes out and does stuff, and he's smart enough to not need a handler to go out and do his own stuff. But that,
Yeah.
that explanation, just to me, now that I'm really thinking about it, that explanation doesn't track nearly as much.
Well, they try
But
and
they-
shoehorn in an explanation in this episode, which is that like he's lonely. It's weird. Yeah, they're like, oh yeah, Mycroft's lonely, and that's why that's why he keeps Sherlock around. It's like, what? Huh?
Yeah, and then the way they played it off, it was like he didn't say, "Oh, you're right. I'm learning about myself. I am lonely." It was like, "No, you're utterly wrong. I'm not lonely. I am like a weird version of human that doesn't get lonely." You
It's
can't
so
really tell
bizarre.
where they were going. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the only note I actually had about that scene where Sherlock is getting shaved, which I love the idea that the first thing that they do, when they get back, and he's like, "I need a barber." First thing, skip the shower, need
Yeah.
a barber, because you got to get rid of the beard, otherwise he's a criminal and he's crazy.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. You guys get it. It's Hollywood.
Yeah, but the weird thing now that I'm thinking about it is that he gives the explanation that it took me 2 years to dismantle Moriarty's network, right? And I don't understand what he was doing, because Moriarty didn't have a network. He was the king of the underworld. He did everything. He had hired guns, but that's all we ever see in all of these things, that he was the criminal mastermind behind it. With episode 2, he hired them, or he, orchestrated it, and then he killed them. So I don't know what Sherlock was doing, and I don't think they did a great job of explaining why it took him 2 years to dismantle a network that Moriarty, I don't see him having that in place in the first place. He liked to pull the spider webs. It would have been him doing everything. It's not like he had this legion of generals that were out there doing criminal stuff,
So, okay. I think I agree with you. I think what they're trying to do here is imply that there was more going on with Moriarty than we knew, because they're trying to be like, maybe he's not gone. This is them being like, if we imply that there was a bigger network and there was a bigger plan, there's a possibility that he didn't really die. This feels like, if I had to like put on my Stephen Moffat hat, this is that maneuver of trying to plant the seed of doubt of like, oh, he had a network that we didn't know about. Interesting. Well, I wonder what other implications that may have. Not
Well,
saying
I think it might be, it might be simpler. That the biggest antagonistic thing in this episode is John accepting him back and Sherlock realizing how much he hurt John. So without a really solid reason for Sherlock being gone for 2 years, the audience will be angry at Sherlock, and the audience, isn't supposed to be angry at Sherlock.
Yeah,
So
I guess. But we should be. Like, it's okay. You can have characters that people don't like for periods of time. I think this is still a symptom of them revealing that he was alive at the end of the last season. Because I think if we started this season not knowing he was alive, when it's like, oh, well, what's he been up to? We would be like, oh, that's a pretty shitty explanation. Why hasn't he talked to John yet? Instead, it's kind of framed as like this thing that he had to do, and then it's brushed aside as like justified by it's justified by Mycroft and Sherlock in that conversation. Whereas I think if we were finding out for the first time that he was alive in this sequence, it might have a bit more of the impact that you're talking about, which is like, okay, but why wouldn't he just tell John he's alive? That seems like a real dick move. Like, what's going on there? And then you could have something like, I couldn't have revealed myself in case Moriarty was still alive or something. Like, you could have had some tension there where it would have been something John had to accept instead of the explanation we get, which is just like, he doesn't tell John. Full stop.
Yeah.
Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, talking about John, like, I think this episode is another assassination of his character, because he is supposed to be growing and getting better throughout all of these, and yet as soon as Sherlock dies, he utterly breaks and he runs away from everything. This scene with Mrs. Hudson, he has literally not even given her a phone call in this entire time, and she's been like a mother to them, and she lost one of her sons, and he was like, I couldn't call you. I was suffering too much, which is, I mean, that's acceptable on one level, but on the other hand, I'm like, man up and go, take care of other people even if you're hurting. So I would have loved to have seen this start off with, like, he and Molly have taken up the business and they are doing their best to fill in the gaps in the absence of Sherlock. And, like, even the trailer for this could have been, it's Sherlock season 3, but Sherlock's not there. John has taken over the investigatory business. And, like, it could have been a great thing, but they have to keep beating John's character down into the dirt. And maybe he's the realistic real man who can't be noble on his own. He has to have Sherlock with him, but
He's
I just don't like that.
He's the sidekick, bro. You just made a really good pitch for a season of television, by the way. That's a really good idea. I have, so as part of the book I'm working on, off the back of the show, there's an element of it where I'm writing a perspective, like, wrap-up episode, sort of. It's not really an episode. I'm writing, like, a pitch of, like, what happened after the end of Sherlock, and you almost hit on, like, a plot thread I was going to put in there. There's something about this universe without Sherlock in it that's really interesting, and I don't know why. Like, it makes you go, like, how would people cope without this force of superintelligence, knowing that it had existed?
Because that's a really strong theme in a whole lot of, I want to say it's more like fantasy type stuff, where the absence of power is what creates the story, and it's usually like the absence of a super strong magician or something like that, the absence of King Arthur or whatever you want to call it, and it's how people are coping with that is so interesting, and talking about this mythological figure that most of the audience might not even have seen. They're just, they're dealing with the aftermath of how do we live without this amazing person.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point. There's some, there's a lot of, I mean, obviously, the big ones that come to mind, like, obviously, Stephen King's Dark Tower is exactly that. It's like, what happens when, like, all of the good goes out of the world, and, like, how do you deal with it then? But yeah, you're right. I mean, like, Lord of the Rings, what happens when, like, the ring falls out of, like, the eye of the world and time moves on? Like, how does everybody cope when that source of power is gone? Okay, so I do want to call out that we do get a shot of Sherlock heading back to London, and he basically is, like, on the rooftops like Batman, just, like, standing there and, like, surveying his domain.
It is so cheesy, and I adore that shot.
Yeah,
it is so Sherlock. Like, it's stupid, but when he was like, I need to breathe in London again, and he said that, and then he goes
literally.
and does it.
He
literally meant it.
Like, it's so funny to me. The show is so goofy. It's like, I need to breathe it in again, and then it's just him on a rooftop, like, yes. You're like, well, you meant that? I thought, okay. I thought you were being metaphorical. Okay, no.
Yeah. I mean, I probably love it so much because there's something, because probably just being a fan of Star Wars and George Lucas, and, like, being honest and cheesy can be really entertaining and really heartfelt. And that's what this felt like. That's what this felt like to me.
Yeah, I'll buy that.
There were a couple interesting things just before this. One was them again, which they do all the time, and I'm just realizing it. They gave away the solve at the very beginning because the transitions that we see are the tubes.
Yeah.
Just like the taxis at the very beginning, just like we've seen multiple times. So I feel like if they were going to do a new season, like they announced a new season for next year, now that I'm looking for this stuff, I'm going to be able to do the solve like that because the transitions that they use. I'm going to be like, oh, it's a plane. It's a plane that kills them.
It's a plane that did it.
And then the last note that I had was... It's already happened twice, but I wrote gay jokes times 6, and that was only in the first couple paragraphs. So Mrs. Hudson does, like, actually it's like 3 in a row, I think. she's like, oh, what's his name? And so soon after Sherlock, and then she's like, oh, it's not a man. So it's like multiple gay jokes in that one scene, and then you had, I'm going to call it a gay joke of Anderson's. Actually, this may be later on when they're looking at how Sherlock could have escaped, and it shows him and Moriarty going in to kiss each other, and then the camera cuts as the one girl telling the story at Anderson's little thing.
Yeah.
Like there are so many. I feel like it ramped up the number of gay jokes that you see in this, single episode.
We'll talk about why when we get to that scene with the conspiracy theories. It's a very deliberate maneuver, I think, from the writers here. Yeah, but good to call attention to that. I skimmed over because I'll talk about it at that point. But yeah, the frequency, the volume, and the I don't know what are the obviousness of it. Like it's very on face now. Previously, it was a little bit more subtle. Yeah. Yep. Wouldn't it be funny?
Which is odd because I loved how it played out. Like I love that scene with Mrs. Hudson and just how incredulous John is, and he's like, I like women, guys. I'm gonna get married, and she's like, you do.
The problem, See, this is the thing. I like the chemistry, and I like that relationship with Miss Hudson, but the punchline is, wouldn't it be funny if he was gay? And it's like, come on. That's not, let's try a bit harder, guys. Like, I don't know. Yeah, it's we'll get there when we talk about the conspiracy theorists. Anything else before the restaurant?
The only other thing which I don't know what made me pick up on this, and I think I end up looking at stuff like camera positioning and lighting and scene decoration and stuff. I think I end up looking at that way more than you, who are more focused on story stuff. And I'm thinking that I'm realizing that all those breaks that you take every 15 minutes and you're like, I got to walk away, I can't focus on the story. And I think that is when I start looking at all of this filmmaking stuff. So I think I'm taking those breaks too, but then I'm like, okay, I'm bored. What's the camera doing right now? Or I'm bored. What's this transition? I'm bored. Does their clothing make sense? Does X, Y, Z? Yeah. And that's when because I'm not always looking at the stuff the cinematographer would be looking at, but I realize that I think that's when I actively start looking for it, is when the story isn't really gripping my attention.
It's like it's like when you're pulled out of it, you start to notice the construction.
Yeah,
and interesting.
So the reason I had said that is because I had mentioned this before, but you see it a couple times when John is in there talking to Mrs. Hudson, where normally when a character is talking and they're talking to someone over here, they will be framed like this, where they're on this side of the screen and they're facing the direction that they're talking. So if Mrs. Hudson is over here, I would be framed like this. There would be empty space right here, and John would be speaking this way. So many times, and it happens a lot when he's talking with Sherlock, but it happened a couple times here, it's framed like this, where he's talking to Mrs. Hudson, who's over here. John is in this corner of the screen, and there's all this empty space back here. Yeah. So it throws off the entire shot. And I've talked about them doing that before, whether that's just to make the audience feel off balance and it's like subconscious so they don't see it. And it would be interesting to go back and look at all of those different times that they do that and see if those are all of the situations in which John did not have the moral high ground. So the camera was physically showing him being off center. But it was just something that I clocked as being a really an intentional and odd filmmaking decision. And I'm curious to figure out why they do it.
I mean, the last big one was John and Adler, where they're in that kind of abandoned warehouse and they're talking about Sherlock, and he's frustrated with her because she vanished. Must be something to do with like sadness or like isolation or something. Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but just let's keep watching over the next season and a half, and I'm curious if we could come up with some kind of thought process that they're going on.
Yeah, let's pay more attention than the showmakers did to their own show and see if we can't find a reason for it.
Or maybe the cinematographer was just like not paying attention and the camera just drifts over sometimes.
Or he was like on sick leave that day and it was like his assistant doing it.
Yeah, the next note that I have is at the restaurant.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll set the scene up. I'm going to set up till we get thrown out of the restaurant because it's kind of two chunks that kind of come together here. So At the Landmark, a posh restaurant, Sherlock impulsively steals some horn-rimmed glasses and a bow tie from various people, takes an eyeliner pencil from a lady's purse and gives himself a false mustache, then uses a phony French accent as he attends to John's table, while John is in the process of trying to propose to Mary, his girlfriend. Obviously distracted by what they're focused on, neither Mary nor John recognize Sherlock at first. Sherlock drops his fake accent, and John is astounded when he finally realizes the true identity of their waiter. Though she'd never met Sherlock, Mary also figures out who it is and is as incredulous as John. Sherlock wipes his mustache off as John tries to keep calm, but when Sherlock asks John if he's going to keep his mustache, John tackles Sherlock to the floor. They are then apparently thrown out of the restaurant, and then we cut to them in a shabbier restaurant. We get Sherlock being flippant about John's attitude several more times. We get another punch, and then we eventually end up in a really cheap restaurant. Okay. I'm gonna say something nice, which is I really like the way that. So first of all, I think Mary is brilliantly cast. She has great chemistry with both of them. I really like the way that they've written John here, as he is attempting to propose, and just the way that ends up being complicated for him internally, and kind of how he keeps trying to like build up to asking, and then she's kind of making fun of him a little bit because she sees how hard he's trying. I thought that was really endearing for their relationship, and it gives her a really good indication of like why they're together and what their life might look like. We get a little bit of that later on as well. That I really, really enjoy. I also like the cut to the series of, increasingly less fancy restaurants. I think that's fine. The ruse itself of the fake waiter is some of the goofiest shit I've ever seen in my entire life. And they play it with this like upbeat kind of violin based song, and it's supposed to be like, look at Sherlock back at his antics. And the whole time I'm like, I'm going to be cinema sins for a second. Sherlock takes their order and actually does get John the champagne, which meant that he was able to successfully interface with the rest of the restaurant waitstaff and collect a bottle of wine. Like, what is happening? Because I don't know about you guys. I've worked at a restaurant. If some random guy just like came into the kitchen area, you'd be like, who the fuck are you? You don't work here. I thought that was just... I mean, suspension of disbelief. Maybe in a scene that was less goofy, I wouldn't have minded, but that stuck out to me. So ding that on like the cinema sins list. Yeah, what did you think of this sequence? I have a little bit to talk about at the end, but that's kind of my general thoughts.
There was so much in the scene that I just absolutely adored. The acting is a huge part of it. The way that John gets angry, the way that Mary reacts, because she reacts in a way where she knows what this means to John. So it's not her reacting like, oh, he's alive, this is a surprise. It's like, oh, this is about to break John because he had finally like recovered.
Yeah, it's like an
about
oh
to break
shit
him
moment.
all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love, like you said, I love what they did with her character, because they make her competent in a way that John should be competent. After all of the investigatory stuff that he's done, he should be able to read so much more. And she's like, yeah, you're proposing to me. I see that you're proposing to me. I see that you're an idiot, but you're cute, so I'm just going to let this keep going. Mm-hmm. And then later on, she doesn't need to be told who Sherlock is. She's never seen him. She should need, I mean, maybe she's seen pictures in the paper. That would be logical. But just from John's reaction, that's all that she needed. I think maybe there was like one line of dialogue that Sherlock says. But as goofy as that scene is, I absolutely love it because I love Inspector Clouseau so much, and I am convinced, utterly convinced, that scene is in there because one of the writers is a huge fan, especially of the Steve Martin version, because that is exactly what it feels like to me, with the music, with the acting, with the accent.
I'd buy that, yeah. Yeah, I could see that. A little homage, yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. I agree with the CinemaSins bit, but also depending on the size of the restaurant, depending on like for instance, this is such a terrible comparison because this was like a 5-star restaurant, and I'm about to talk about Waffle House, but but when I worked there, we semi-frequently would have people from other stores come to fill in shifts. So it wasn't completely unheard of to have someone come in wearing a uniform that I had no idea who they were. But if you come back behind there and start doing dishes, I'm like, okay, you work here. Like, I'm not going to second guess that because you're taking the burden off me. And it's Waffle House, you don't ask questions.
No, ask no questions, tell no lies in Waffle House. That's their motto.
And again, I said this earlier, but the tension that builds up to when John stands up and furiously pounds his fist on the table, which utterly cuts, like, I think it cuts all sound out, and there had been like a music build up. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love how they did that. And then John like almost cannot talk. He is so furious. Like I adore the way that they played this out, and the patience that they had in editing to let it play out instead of trying to get to the next funny bit where they're making fun of his mustache for whatever reason. I don't get it. I didn't think it looked bad. Did it look bad? It's a mustache.
No, this is my Moffat moment, Darth. So, in the original Sherlock Holmes stories, it was a point of comedic tension between Watson and Holmes that Holmes thought that Watson's mustache was silly and he looked like an idiot with it. And it made him look like an old man. And it's like a constant source of intonation for both of them, where it's like, you know, Sherlock will make a little quip about it here or there. And this is clearly Moffat being like, do you remember the original? Do you remember that? Here's a little joke about that. And it's like, yeah, I get it, Steve. I get it. So yeah, that's my Moffat moment. It adds very little to the episode, but if you know what he's talking about, you go, oh yeah, I remember that from the stories, but it doesn't do anything.
Well, it's funny because they already addressed that with Mrs. Hudson, like multiple times, and she's doing it because she's angry and she's trying to hurt him, but she's like, are you going to keep this? It ages you. It doesn't work for you. Mm-hmm. And then I think they additionally only had Sherlock to do it because it's mildly funny, and then you get the punchline later on of, I don't shave for Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
So unless you have him constantly making fun of it, and then point out, oh, Mary doesn't like it either, then you don't get that funny punchline, which I literally want to have on a t-shirt one day because it's just funny to me. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. The next point that I had was, again, about John in here, and he angrily says in that one word to let me know you're alive. Given what we ended up talking about at the end of last time, how there are legitimately a handful of clues that we could say Sherlock dropped to let him know that this was a magic show, that his death was not real, that he's coming back, that everything is okay. There were clues, and they don't, like, the writers don't say it. Like, I don't understand it. They dropped all of these clues. They have John be angry that Sherlock didn't leave clues, and Sherlock doesn't say, you're an idiot, I left you clues, you just didn't see them. Yeah. Like, that's how this should have played out. So that the audience is not so angry at Sherlock, because that's what it ends up being, is that we say it is right for Sherlock to keep punching John because John hurt him. But Sherlock was like, I told you multiple times. That's what should have happened, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the writers forgot that happened, is my best guess. Like, this is just like this is like one of those, like, oh, we didn't reread that script before we did this one, probably. Yeah, because him, and I also would have enjoyed him being like, did you not pick up on, and then list a series of things he did. And Watson could come back and be like, of course I didn't. That's completely absurd. What are you talking about? Like, just send me a fucking text message. Like, that could have been a really good, like, and you would have been like, oh yeah, Sherlock Holmes is really a twat. Like, that would have been a good moment to have that kind of, that feeling of like, Sherlock did what he thought was the right thing to let Watson know, but then Watson's like, no, you were thinking about yourself, not about me. Like, of course I'd never know how to fucking, read those clues and work it out. Like, you never think about me. And that could have been a much better cadence there, where it's sort of like Sherlock tried, because one of the things that we often talk about is like, it's important that a character tries to do something that they perceive to be the right thing. Whether or not it is the right thing comes down to like their state of mind and the state of the world and the morals of the story. Where it's like, just because someone does the wrong thing to us morally doesn't mean they aren't doing the right thing in their own eyes. But the important thing is they have to be doing something for us to perceive them to be like a force of protagonism. And Sherlock just like not acknowledging that he tried to tell John, I think takes a little bit away from that. And as you say, means that we go, well, he's just kind of a dick. He should have said something. And so we kind of miss a trick of the complexity of their relationship there as well. What I do like, though, is during this, Sherlock tries twice to explain how he survived, like, his suicide, and John is not interested. I thought that was really, really well written. I think John just being like, I don't care how you did it, like, and Sherlock thinking that's the important thing, because the show is centering that as the important thing. And it's because, we open with that shot, we're about to cut away to Sherlock revealing he's back, and then we're going to cut to the conspiracy theorist, and we'll talk about why it's important how he survived to some viewers, and why John, as our point of view character, is saying, no, it doesn't matter how he survived. What matters is he's back. That, to me, if John is our point of view character, that's the show saying, hey, we don't care how he survived. What matters is that he's back and the implications of that. And that's
I wish they had really leaned into that, because I think it would have been brilliant to, I was going to say give a middle finger to the audience, but I don't really mean it in that kind of like antagonistic way. But we know the audience has been raving for years and trying to figure out how Sherlock lived. So if the show had completely cut out all of the theories, because when you see all of these visual theories, it kind of explains things in a different way than if they had just not shown them at all. But the show literally just doesn't show it. They don't acknowledge it. They could have had multiple times where Sherlock tries to explain it, and either John or Mary or whoever says, we don't care how you did it. And then the audience is sitting there like, I care, I want to know. And so the entire episode could have gone by without any actual explanation on screen being offered, which would have been kind of brilliant, because that's the one thing that the audience came there to see. And denying them that could have been a really interesting decision.
I mean, it does. This goes a step further in the worst direction, though, which is it pretends it's going to explain itself and never does, and makes fun of you for wanting an explanation, which we'll talk about in a minute. Like, I think it not only, I think it takes the worst version of that option and is like, well, I'm going to dunk on these nerds for even thinking they're owed an explanation for how this happened. And it's just like deeply cynical in that sense. One thing I didn't note, though, is there's a really crucial thing, which is at the end, Mary and John leave to go home, and then Sherlock goes home by himself. And then John is sort of talking, like, he's obviously still upset about it. And so they kind of go off in their different directions, which is sort of an interesting little moment where, John doesn't even say goodbye. He's just sort of on a street away, and they get a cab and they disappear. So what we do get, though, is Mary and Sherlock having a brief word where she's like, he'll come around, don't worry, I'll have a word to him. And so you get Mary understanding how important that relationship is to both of them, and sort of wanting them to make good and resolve this tension, which I think is just like, again, as you say, she is really intuitive in that sense, and she has a really good read of John and what he needs. I think that's really a clever inclusion, in my view.
Yeah, and one thing I'm looking at the scene where right before they split ways, Sherlock does a read on her. So he sees that she's left-handed, short-sighted, all of this stuff. I think it could have been a really good moment of characterization for this to be the second person ever that he can't read.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of just making it the woman and she's super special, just make it a thing where, like, anyone who is not necessarily a spy, but anyone who has learned how to read people knows how to cover up the things about themselves. And making her, her being a spy, you could say that she knows how to hide all of these things, and that would have been a really cool moment for him to just be confused, because he's like, I like this woman. I really like the aggressiveness and the way, the confidence, and then he tries to read her and he's like, there's nothing there. What's going on?
It's that's so legitimately so funny you mentioned that, because I was I've been doing rewrites of book 3, and there's an exact scene where a character does that, because like I've got some of that apparatus in there where it's like, the kind of cold reading mechanism that's lifted a bit from the Sherlock. And there's literally a character who has been doing it for so long that when you try to read them, like it's either it's either things that are misdirects or you don't get enough information. And stuff like that is you have to think through, well, like what would a craftsman of this be able to focus on, and how would they deploy their knowledge in order to like combat people using it against them? But it seems like for the most part, unless as you say, it's the woman, the show is really not interested in that at all. It's like, oh no, this power just works on everybody, obviously. Like there's no kind of, like Sherlock doesn't do anything to combat people cold reading him either, right? Like there's just sort of, it's just everyone can be cold read, and that's a bit less interesting.
Well, you had said it back in when we did that episode, was we don't really know if he can't read Irene because she's a woman or because she's naked. Mm-hmm. And it never like super fully explains that. So if they had done that here, then it could have tied into the fact that you're supposed to infer that he just can't read women. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's a good thing they didn't do it, but I think it could have made a whole lot of sense. The spy explanation that I gave a minute ago.
I totally like that. Yeah, I think that would have added a really nice layer to her character as well, setting up what's to come as well, right? Like getting that hint of like maybe she's not, not all that she appears on the surface.
Yeah, and then him reading all of this stuff, and he gets all of these little details about her. He has like the size of her shoes, and there's a lot of stuff packed on screen here in all of the text that he sees, and there is no indication of the spy stuff until the skip code at the end of the episode.
Yeah.
So for him to do such an in-depth reading and miss all of the important stuff is also just weird.
I hadn't really thought about that before. That's interesting. It's weird, but it's also like, I guess they're trying to make her competent as well, and to sort of be an not equal intellect, but equal force of will to him, I guess, in some sense. And so not having him be unable to read that is interesting. I think that it's, as you say, it would be more interesting if it was overt. Or even if there was 2 or 3 details he couldn't read, where like maybe he picks up on a few things and then he tries to look at like, I don't know what the example would be, but like, there's a particular piece of jewelry and it's like, manufactured ? Or something. Like you could have had a few details be obscured or something. I'm not sure execution wise what that would look like, but yeah, I think I agree with you that it's sort of a missed opportunity.
All right, yeah. So going into the next scenes are all him appearing to all his friends.
Yeah. So there's nothing. I don't really have many notes on this, but basically he reveals he's back to Molly, Lestrade, and Mrs. Hudson. The Mrs. Hudson one is annoying because it's a loud scream and it's just annoying.
And the camera shoots down her throat for some reason.
Very unpleasant. I don't.
Like, they do so good with so many transitions, and
every now and then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really didn't like that. Molly, Lestrade. I quite like Lestrade because he's just like, you bastard.
Yes.
Lestrade continues to be my favorite character.
I adore that one because he, like, again, this is giving credit to the editor for being able to pause for so long. Because he just sits there with the smoke and he doesn't light it because he hears the voice, and it's like 5 solid seconds of him just sitting there mentally coming to grips with the fact. And then the first thing out of his mouth is cursing at him.
And it's so good too because he's like I don't necessarily read the delivery which communicates exactly what he's thinking. Where he's not angry. He's just like, of course you're not dead. Like it's this kind of like he's incredulous, I guess.
Yeah, which is really interesting because that ties into the beginning, and it almost validates having the Anderson scenes with him earlier because he was adamantly saying Sherlock is dead, you have to let him go, and now he's like, well, I guess I was wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's also this thing that happens where he tells Molly, or Lestrade, I can't think of who. He tells one of them that he's not ready for the world to know that Sherlock Holmes is back yet, which I thought was interesting, given what happens next. Or is that
you mean Sherlock says that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're it was when they're bouncing between all the different restaurants,
Ah, okay.
and Sherlock says, "Quiet! I don't want the world to know I'm back yet. Promise you'll keep my secret." And John shouts out, "Swear to God!" and then realizes he's been shouting Sherlock's name all over
Yes.
the place.
I that doesn't end up going anywhere because in the next anyway, that just like that plot thread goes nowhere. Him not revealing himself doesn't have anything to do with the plot. It's just a weird thing they added in.
They, I could see what they were going for, and I'm pretty sure that the idea was Sherlock is being called back because London is in mortal jeopardy, and if London does not know that he's back, he will have the upper hand. So I'm pretty sure that's what they were going for, but he didn't wear a disguise or anything. He's just
Yeah,
walking around with one of the most famous faces in London.
dressed
So,
like Sherlock Holmes as well.
yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
um,
Okay, so let's talk about the fan club and then death of the author, and then we'll take a break and then talk about the back half of the episode. So, do you have anything else in these little interstitial moments, or should we talk about the fan club?
the only thing that's really odd, Molly was the first person that he appeared to, which also makes the least sense because she is the one who knew he wasn't dead. So having this big reveal where he shows up and he's like, "I'm alive," and she's like, "I knew you were alive. I helped hide the body that pretended to be you." So that reveal is just confusing, but I wish that they had kind of done it better, maybe done her last or something. And so it's not a "Hey, I'm alive," it's "Hey, I'm back. Let's get back to work." If they had like phrased hers differently somehow.
Got it.
Of course, you don't. I don't know. They don't do enough explanation to really show what she did that was so important, which we talked about in his death scene. Was he said that you were the key to this? Moriarty thought you weren't important. You were the most important. You're the reason this is going to work. We don't really know why that is, but hey, he's going to appear to her first because she was the most important in whatever scheme.
In some whatever capacity, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think this, yeah, it's, I mean, I don't know how else you do this, to be honest. But yeah, I would have tweaked the dialogue potentially. Okay. Boy. All right, let's try and get into this. It's going to be a tricky one to try and unpack. So, in a Sherlock fan club, which exists in universe, Anderson is arguing with another member who proposes an overly hilarious theory that involves Sherlock and Moriarty dangling a Sherlock-sized dummy off the roof, with the head being a horribly glued-on photo of Sherlock, exchanging laughs at John's cries of anguish, then leading into kiss to the swell of romantic music, when the television announces that Sherlock is indeed alive. So we cut before we get the kiss. Okay. Tell me what you think of this, and then I wanna really sort of pick it apart and get into some of the theory here. What do you think about the Sherlock fan club? What do you think about this theory, or this kind of setup, I guess?
I guess the weirdest thing to me is not really realizing through all of the years that my brother and I watched this show and talked about and loved the show, of how much of this stuff was external and being, massively talked about in all these blogs and stuff online, that this group of people sitting around posing theories about how he survived was like literally happening in the real world.
Yeah.
Is just so fascinating to kind of think back and think of all the stuff that I missed out on being late to the internet.
Yeah, isn't it weird? I mean, the idea of the writers taking the fans and inserting them into the show is
Yeah.
so interesting for so many reasons. Yeah.
And like one of the most interesting things about the way that they did this is that it's not this one group, because all of them start getting these. It's hard to tell if they're notifications from Twitter, if they're notifications from some social media, or if they're direct text messages. But all of them start getting multiple messages, which leads you to infer that there are multiple groups like this all over the place.
Yeah.
So the show is hinting very strongly at how big this same group of people is in real life, because there's that many people that were all tweeting Sherlock lives and coming up with these theories, and would have communicated with each other immediately just like this as soon as they spot him around the city.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really interesting. Now that I know what I'm looking for, the gay joke thrown in there just, it makes me cringe.
Just sucks, doesn't it?
but I know that's for whatever reason that's part of their humor for the show. So I'm kind of just wondering if I should just accept it and just try to try to laugh at it. Because I mean, most of us spent
Yeah.
our like high school years making gay jokes anyway, so it seems kind of familiar to a whole lot of people.
Yeah,
But
2013 was a different time. I yeah, I so the thing is, there are shows at the time that have characters in them that like Doctor Who and Torchwood have pretty decent representation for the most part of the LGBTIQ plus community. They have pretty decent, with the notable exception of any character Moffat has written or some episodes of Torchwood, but it's pretty good by and large. So like even at the time, there's very little excuse for this. So I even think the thing I just said about 2013 being a different time is probably letting this off the hook a little. You just don't need to do this. But also, this is a very specific maneuver as well. That this theory includes them being romantically involved is a very specific kind of maneuver. You have Anderson be like, that's silly, like, take this seriously. And there is an extent to which that is an exact response of certain fandoms to other fandoms. Being like, well, the thing that you're saying is obviously silly and wrong. Like, why aren't you taking these theories seriously? We're actually trying to find out what happened, which we talked a little bit about in the previous episode.
And there's a hilarious comparison to Star Wars, which is that a lot of people say that there's a really strong theory that the kids were Obi-Wan's and Padme's, and that Anakin was not the father.
Yeah.
Because there's I mean, not strong evidence, but there's some stuff in there.
The fact that Ewan McGregor has chemistry with Natalie Portman is because Ewan McGregor has chemistry with everyone. Like,
I was about to say that.
It's just like it just happens to also be that like Hayden Christensen and Padme don't have chemistry. Yeah. Well, I guess so. We should talk about Death of the Author then, and I guess what is happening here at a formal level with the inclusion of these conspiracy theorists. How much do you know about Death of the Author as a concept, Darth?
I'm pretty sure that it's a book.
Okay, so nothing. It was an essay. So okay, Roland Barthes, in his original essay from 1977, this is kind of his thesis. So, quote, writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away. The negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body of writing. Quote. So I'll try and explain this. So Barthes is elaborating on the ideas of Bertolt Brecht. Barthes argues that the contemporary understanding of the author as present throughout the conception, consumption, and reflection of text limits the text. So basically, in saying that the author is present in the creation, the audience consuming, and then the audience trying to understand the text, the suggestion that the author's intent should be present throughout every stage of that restricts the modes of userly engagement. It is placing a artificial restriction on interpretation and restricts readerly authority. The idea being that just because an author says that this thing is that way, that Dumbledore is gay, just because Joe Rowling said that, doesn't mean that when you read the text, you can't read the text and go, actually, Dumbledore isn't presented with a sexual orientation in the text. He is he is not presented in any type of way with sexuality in the text. But the crucial thing about Barthes and Death of the Author is that he contends that these ideologues are in tension with each other. So for the reader to exist and have authority over the text, the author's influence must die, and vice versa. If you want to read a text with an authorly influence, you have to kill the reader, in a sense. And so the idea is that authorial intent and readerly autonomy have to be acknowledged as in conflict. Does that make sense as like a very baseline kind of concept?
Yeah, it's interesting that I haven't thought about it that way too much. That there are some stories that you could feel the author like forcing their perspective on the audience, and like the writer in me is like, that's fine because this is the story I am telling, and you are not going to infer something else about it because it is black and white, and this is my story, and you can enjoy it if you want, but it's my story, and you don't get to interpret it the way you want to. So I understand that, but at the same time, on the flip side, it's like you've said so many times, the audience interprets the story based on the century they're in and the social period that they're in and all of this other stuff. So even if I force the story I want down their throat, there's probably nothing the author can do in the end of it to solidify that so the audience can't interpret it in their own fashion.
Yes. And that's exactly what I was saying last season when there are phrases that we use a lot in creative writing of things like, meaning is created at the time of reception, not the time of creation. When you receive a text, that is when you form meaning around that text. Something that you often criticize different texts for, which I think is a valid criticism, is they left something as subtext that ought to have been explicit text. And so this kind of stuff is playing in that realm. It's why I thought Bart's was really important to bring to this conversation. So let me read another snippet from Bart's essay, and then we'll talk about a question you often ask of text and what I think Barthes and Foucault and Flaubert can teach us here. So per Barthes' closing lines of his essay, quote, "We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogant, antiphrastic recriminations of good society in favor of the very thing it sets aside, ignores, smothers, or destroys. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." Quote. And I always adore that final line, because the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author is such a crystallization of this theory.
Yeah.
Now,
very poignant.
A lot of contemporaries, and I'll talk about this in a second, a lot of contemporaries, go, Barthes is going a bit too far. The idea that these two things can't exist together in tension at the same time is definitely, a modern, I guess, modernist. So, I would consider myself a modernist in kind of literary criticism. Modernists will argue that, the reader's interpretation and the authorial intent, they aren't mutually exclusive. You can read a text and acknowledge both, and how you maneuver through both and how you understand how both are functioning is how you can create meaning or assess the success of a text. It's often why you'll hear me. So you often ask a question like, was that intentional, or did the author accidentally? Or I don't think that they meant to do that on purpose. To Bart's mind, it doesn't matter whether it was intentional. If you took that meaning from the text, it is a valid reading. Whether or not the example that a few contemporaries talk about is, I've mentioned this before. Let's say that you're writing a scene in a bedroom and you need somebody to pull back the curtains. You might give those curtains a color, and you might just say, hey, they're purple curtains, because whatever, you had to give them a color. You just gave them a color. Someone could read that text and be like, well, actually, what you'll find is that the curtains are purple because the character is going through this melancholic journey where previously they were surrounded by blues and they're moving more toward oranges, sort of representing sunrise and the change of their mental state. And the author could come back and be like, bro, they were just purple. I had to pick a color. Now, is the reader's interpretation incorrect? Well, some would say yes, because it was not intentional. I think that's a knee-jerk reaction from a lot of people that aren't particularly well-read or have just had a high school English education, is they'll say maybe a fucking curtain's just purple. Why are you making such a big deal of it? But I think to Bart's point, this idea becomes the genesis for Foucault and then modern media criticism. And I guess I want to move past Bach because I think his model is too restrictive, but it is important to understand that foundation, which is, in his mind, they're mutually exclusive. In modernists, we've moved to this idea that they exist in tension together, and exploring that tension can be really rewarding as an academic exercise. To give you an example, so Flaubert, for those who don't know, was a pretty successful fiction writer. He was a French dude, as was Brecht. Now, Flaubert wrote Madame Bovary, which is considered to be, I don't know how else to explain it. It's considered to be the perfect book, in that, in French, so I read it in both French and English when I spoke French fluently. It's a story of Emma Rousseau, who's a beautiful young woman in provincial France. the story is this like interweaving melodrama where Emma marries very quickly and then finds herself hungry for romance and indulges in various fantasies and affairs, and these affairs eventually lead to a bunch of debt, and she eventually takes her own life. And the work of the book is kind of twofold, right? Flaubert steps beyond his limits with Emma and pens one of the first contemporary novels because it favors the interior psychology of its protagonist, which basically takes it from like, this is not my wording, this is like how people talk about it. It takes it from realism, which is describing what's happening, to like modern literature, where you understand what's happening through the emotional lens of a protagonist. And it often gets praised as one of the best novels ever written. And having read it in the original French, like it is incredible. Like it's beautiful. And he had this approach which he describes as le mot juste, which in English is the just word. So he had this idea that in every sentence there could be a perfect construction that suited what the sentence was about, and then in every paragraph there was a perfect rhythm you could achieve by crafting every sentence with the perfect construction, and sort of so on and so forth, until you get this book, which is, as you read it, it just feels everything is so precise, and that every detail matters. Even in the English translations, I definitely recommend reading it. The feeling this book gives you is as you read it, you exactly understand how Emma feels about everything that's going on. Even if you don't directly understand what's happening in a scene, you always know what she's feeling and how she's reacting. And the reason I foreground a text like Madame Bovary and Flaubert in the context of Barthes is for two reasons. This book and I guess Barthes' academic side of his work sets the foundation for Proust and Joyce and Woolf, who end up becoming the precursors to Doyle when he writes the original Sherlock stories. So you can actually trace a direct line from Madame Bovary into the writers that Doyle is working with and writing and reading that influences Sherlock stories. But for me, the really crucial thing here is it brings us into proximity with Foucault's idea of narrative as metaphorized effacement, which I'll try and explain here. I don't think this is particularly crazy for modern readers, but at the time, this was pretty revolutionary. Well, before I do that, have you ever heard of Madame Bovary? I wouldn't imagine you have. It's pretty like...
The name is very familiar. However, there's zero chance I would have ever read it.
Yeah, it's very like, if you've done a writing degree, you'll have read this at some point, but otherwise no one's ever heard of it. So per Foucault, quote, using all the contrivances that he sets up between himself and what he writes, the writing subject cancels out the signs of his particular individuality. As a result, the mark of the writer is reduced to nothing more than the singularity of his absence. He must assume the role of the dead man in the game of writing. End quote. So what he's saying is that as a writer, he's kind of taking Barthes' idea and then evolving it a little bit. And instead of saying, in order for the reader to exist, the writer must die, he's saying the writer must undertake from the beginning, from the commencement. He must be writing a book in such a way that he is already dead. So you write a book in such a way that like you assume that your authorial intent does not matter, and you focus instead on the way that a reader is going to consume it. And Foucault in this way is like the foundation of like modern academic criticism, right? We'll take two concepts from this and then kind of lay them on top of Sherlock. So I think we have a tendency, Foucault's touching on this a little bit in this essay as well. We have a tendency, particularly as Western readers, to view text through schematic ideas, which is to say, like I was alluding to before with genre convention, this is a detective story, and so we expect X, Y, Z, versus in this horror story, we expect A, B, C. And the author doesn't necessarily precede the work, but is rather a necessary component in the construction of a text. And while the author is related to meaning making, it's not like limited or deterministic, right? This idea of, if I'm writing, let's say, think about a script like Alien, right? The original Alien film. That becomes the foundation for like what horror stories are structured and what they look and they feel like, right? The inclusion of some kind of industrial dispute or some kind of familial dispute. You get that with the workers who aren't paid well, which leads to the distrust of Ripley. And then you get the idea of like, okay, well, in the first sequence, we need to understand the current tensions between the crew, and then we go and we discover that this monster exists, and then we learn something about it, and then we have our first death, and these become kind of repeatable patterns. You think about the James Bond films, where there are certain things that you expect to happen, right? You need to have the initial villain set something in motion. Bond has to be put onto the case. He has to go rogue at some point. There's got to be a woman he meets. He's going to get captured and be there's he's going to be at gunpoint in the chair, and it's I expect you to die, Mr. Bond. And there are these things that we've come to expect as kind of genre conventions that are very schematic in that sense. And so I guess to pick up Foucault's ideas and wrap them back onto Barthes, while death of the author is probably too extreme, what we should say instead is that the author is a natural part of the ecology of a text and shouldn't necessarily be privileged over any part of the process. So when I say things like, oh, that's a Moffat moment, XYZ, I'm basically imprinting my own suggestion that, hey, we should interpret this moment in the context of authorial intent, versus other moments where I sometimes will push back on claims that you're making, and I go, I maybe think that we should take this with a grain of salt. I don't think the author's meant to do that, or vice versa, when we have those little dialogues, And so what we then have to do, pulling all that together and laying it onto Sherlock, is, in the context of this episode, the role of the reader is assigned to Anderson and his group of conspiracy theorists, right? They are representations or analogs of different modes of reading, or different groups of readers that we see online. Would you say that that's fair as bringing that together, that's a fair foundation, that we go, okay, we know we have this tension of like the authorial intent, and then they deliberately place the readers in the story. Does that track for you so far as the kind of what's happening here formally?
Yeah, and I mean, since you specifically mentioned those people, something else that they were kind of placing in there was that they all look really, really nerdy, and the woman they focus on is goth. So yeah. I'm also wondering how much they're trying to paint the people who do this kind of sleuthing about Sherlock, if they're trying to paint them negatively.
Yeah.
Or if that's just how I'm inferring it now.
Oh, no. This seems to me to be very deliberate. I don't know how else to read this other than deliberate, right? Like you have three theories pitched in this episode. You have the queer reading, so the queer reading with Moriarty. You have the romantic reading with Molly, and then you have at the end like the deep state conspiracy theorist reading, which is Anderson's final one. I think it's negative because basically what the episode seems to be doing with presenting these ideas, and as you say, making them look nerdy and goofy, and like one of them is like, I don't think we should wear the hats, and it means people won't take us seriously, things like that. The episode itself, the text itself, seems to say the authors have the answers, and you just need to cede to these. You need to stop trying to understand what's going on, right? Moffat and Gaddis, in this choice, reject Foucault and Barthes and Bovary, and they end up in this like purely deterministic, like psychoanalytical framework of Freud. Like they are like, whether intentional or not, this maneuver to me communicates that there is a certain type of audience member that exists, and they need to stop having ideas. They need to stop trying to work out the text, right? They need to ditch the paratext. They need to ditch the fandom, ditch the metas, just watch what happens and be impressed with how awesome Sherlock is, right? This to me is what this is communicating.
Yeah.
And if you aren't doing that and you want to try and solve these crimes and these mysteries, you're a crazy lame nerd on the internet that's not worthy of respect, right? You're cooped up in an attic somewhere wearing a stupid hat, right? It seems to me, if I was one of those people on the internet at the time, which I only was tangentially, I would find this really patronizing and really insulting. Like this is the closest you can come in your text to giving your audience the middle finger. Like this is pretty like rough in my view, right? The outcome of this, in my view, is that these fans... So what's happening is these fans are taking specific moments from the text, excising them from the fullness of their context, reinserting them into different contexts, and the text itself says, no, this is silly and dumb. You may as well just be a nutter in a silly hat. Stop doing this, right? Like the author is in charge. We tell you what is important. We tell you how things happen if it matters. Stop asking these questions. And so it feels like a very deliberate, reflexive move for me here of, while Anderson is somewhat likable because he's taking accountability for his actions, the way that this episode ends his character and its position in the world is he's a crazy person, right? Only a crazy person would think that this stuff is worthy of spending time on. Only an idiot nerd would try and solve stuff before Sherlock does. In a detective story where the red hot core of the detective genre is giving, especially the Sherlock Holmes story, is giving the audience the same information as the detective and watching them solve it in a way that you hadn't thought to do, to then suggest to people that are trying to do that in your detective story that doing that is dumb and bad and you're a lame nerd is so deeply disrespectful of the source material and the genre this exists in that it's almost like I don't even know what to call this maneuver. Like, this is sort of almost like a rejection of the context under which your story exists. It's a very, very specific kind of move, and I am always hard placed to in retrospect, and even at the time, I'm very hard placed to understand what they thought would happen when they did this, and even revisiting it now in the context, and we'll talk about what's happening on Tumblr a bit later, but like, this is such a... It's weird and insulting and petty, and I don't understand why it's here. It's very confusing when you put it in the fullness of its context, and knowing that the theories they are directly pushing against are the foundations for Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories, and they were his contemporaries. I find it it's like either deeply ignorant or it's like deliberately malicious in some way. But yeah, that's kind of like what I think is happening here at a formal level with these conspiracy theorists in the context of these stories and, modernism and I guess, like, contemporary literary theory.
I mean, kind of the way that I would interpret it, my point of view, soaking in everything that you just threw at me from these very established, much smarter than me people in the writing community.
Well, they're all weird French guys, so let's not say much smarter. There's a bunch of crazy French academics, but yeah.
Well, yeah, but look how long my beard is getting. So, I'm...
You could be one of them. There you go. We just have to get you a cravat or something.
Okay, I'm gonna Google that word later.
French necktie.
Yeah, you read like 6 words in the course of that. That I was like, that's a 4-syllable word that I've never heard. But anyway, so the idea that the author's voice should not be heard, and that the audience should be entirely in charge of interpreting the story, I don't know that I would agree with that. With that mindset, because for the most part, stories are told because the author has something inside them that they want to get out. It's almost like a gift, because you generally don't write stuff you want to keep hidden. It's because you want to give this story to other people to enjoy, to inspire, whatever you want to do. And some people may say that they want to write a story that can inspire people, and that mandates that the audience is able to interpret it in their own fashion and apply it to their own lives. But at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily wrong if these writers were calling us idiots and they are saying, don't try to figure this out, you're not smart like Sherlock is, because that's literally the point of this show, is the audience is not smart like Sherlock is. So should we be complaining that they are sticking to what they set out to do, which is to write a show that the audience is too dumb to understand? I mean, they're sticking to their guns. They're doing what they set out to do. Yeah. And creatively, I guess I have to respect that they are doing what they wanted to do. And that doesn't invalidate what they're doing. They're telling a story in their particular way. Which is kind of interesting, the explanation that you were giving. It also is so different between written text and film or TV or whatever, where the audience, talking about the audience inferring meaning that the author might not have intended, because in books it is so much easier to get inside the head of the author, because they can write the thoughts going on inside characters' heads in a way that movies and TV rarely do. It's supposed to be visual, but you can't really get the idea that John was feeling bloated and a little angsty. Like, you can't get that stuff unless the character has this inner monologue that you could physically hear. And so in film, you don't really know what the author intended, but in written works, you have a much better idea of what the author intended, and you are not able, as an audience member, to infer your own meaning from the text when there is so much more literal text that you could, go off of.
There's also more authors in visual medium, right? Because when we think about the author, it's like who wrote the script, who edited the script, who's shooting the scene, what are the actors bringing to that scene, and so you suddenly have a much more diverse set of authors that can influence the construction of the text, which means that it's going to change the reception of the text.
Yeah, and the video editor, can completely change the story being told just by how he physically cuts the film together. So it doesn't matter what the script was; the editor could change the entire thing. There's so many moving pieces to this.
We saw that with Donnie Darko, right? If you watch the original director's cut, it's unwatchable garbage. It has exactly what you're describing, which is all of this like unnecessary privileged subtext where that Donnie Darko was narrating the whole thing. The editor, before the film came out, recut the whole thing and basically changed the meaning of the film and made it into like one of the greatest films of all time. The original version's completely unwatchable. And so, as you say, like there are so many other ways that different authors can bring influence onto this particular type of medium as well. Yeah, it's a really interesting point.
But one of the most interesting things to me in the whole spiel you were giving was to me it feels like the difference between headcanon and authorial intent, and I don't know why we have to differentiate so hard to say, like, did the author intend it or did they not intend it? And if they didn't intend it, then it just ruins everything. Like, it is very easy for me to say that some of my favorite things in Star Wars are things that Lucas 100% did not intend to happen. It is my inferring something in the story or something about a character because of this setup, because of backstory in external material. It lets me infer something about Obi-Wan or Anakin, and that's my favorite thing in all of Star Wars, but Lucas didn't intend it. That doesn't ruin the experience for me. That's me interpreting it as I want to, but I am not interpreting, like, I will not argue that that is the point of the story. Like, I will not argue that that is the meaning that everyone should take. Like, I know that is my headcanon. So, like, the whole concept of, like, you have to kill the author for the audience to interpret it properly just kind of doesn't sit with the way that I view media, because it's very easy to say I could see the author intending this. I don't agree with it. This is my version of it, but it's maybe people don't like to separate out their own headcanon and say that's not real,
Yeah, I have so many thoughts off the back of that. I don't want to react to that too heavily now because a lot of the content I have in the second half of this podcast recording is literally about why that happens. Like, why are people so intent on being like, no, this is really what's happening in the text versus, oh, you're just making shit up in your own headcanon. Like, and I'll try and break apart why that is. And it may be just be like, because for my money, I read text pretty similarly to you in that sense, where like there are things I like about certain films or TV or books or whatever, and like some of it is just like, stuff where I'm making an inference based on subtext or making an inference based on text, and it's possible the writer never intended it, but I still enjoy it for that reason. But if someone else disagrees, I'm not exclusionary in that sense. I don't go, well, that's dumb, they're wrong. I just go, hey, that's fine, do what you need to do. But the other thing to keep in mind is that we naturally, as a result of the way that media discussion and criticism has moved to an anticipatory mindset, which is to say speculation has become the vehicle for consuming text and media, where it's the Marvelification of entertainment, which is this idea that it need not matter what's happening in a text as long as one of the outcomes is the speculation of what's to come, is the anticipation of what's to come next. And so we've moved far less from the reflective, reactive meta procedures where, like, particularly at this time on Tumblr 2014, right? People were developing these reactive kind of insulated fandoms. That still happens a little bit. Obviously that was happening with Marvel at the time as well, because the first Avengers film came out. You had people doing that and siloing down. But I think the diversification and the sublimination of these fandoms into hashtags and subreddits and all of this different stuff, like the maneuver is different now. You're going to a specific subreddit because they are talking about the type, they're talking about the text in the way that you want. You always talk about these Star Wars ones that have particular opinions. Back then, it wasn't that you went to a particular place for it. It was that you constructed your own space by combining other blogs together. And so the mechanism was really, really different to what we conceive of now, in a contemporary setting of what do people think is going to happen in the next Guardians of the Galaxy film. That's very different than what was happening back then, which is, it's not just what do you think is going to happen in the next episode of Sherlock. It was, what do you think is going to happen in the next episode of Sherlock, given all of your preconceived, accepted, canonized meta stuff. Like there was a lot higher barrier to entry. It was a lot less like, Marvel said this at Comic-Con. What do you think that means for, the next Spider-Man film? That still happens, but it was a lot more siloed and kind of isolated. So I think to answer your question, and we'll really delve into it after the break, is there is something happening at a social level that is influencing this behavior that sits above the texts themselves. There's something happening socially online that is driving a lot of these decisions and driving a lot of this philosophy around, I fully reject the author's intent and I'm going to create my own headcanon meaning. And if you don't agree with that, you're a fucking loser or you're toxic or whatever. We'll delve into it into some depth, but yeah, there's definitely something happening, and I want to try and pick that apart as to what the genesis of this stuff is. Cool. Well, if that didn't make your brain ache a little bit, we're going to kind of come back after the break. We will talk about the plot of this episode finally, because it's about to start. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with the metas when we get to the end of the episode and unpack exactly what I was talking about there, which is this sort of what is happening socially in these spaces to create these metas and these fandoms, and what's the impact of that having on the people who are in them, and where's it all leading to? Like, how does this set the foundation for our kind of supposed secret final episode? Because we're about to see the beginnings of the theory get solidified and crystallized in the back of this episode. So we will cover that after the break. And then, we'll pick up where we left off with Sherlock and his information wall at the beginning of the investigation finally. So we'll take a quick break and we'll be back with you guys momentarily. This season of Give Up to 3 is brought to you by our fantastic Patreons over at patreon.com/zeroindent. You can join us and support us for as little as $1 a month. If you contribute more than $3 a month, you'll get access to the entirety of this season straight away. So you could listen to episode 2 and 3 and get all the way caught up ahead of season 4. It's a great way to support us and helps us keep doing what we do. We realize this show isn't for everyone, so any support you can provide is amazing. Otherwise, maybe consider telling a friend or a colleague or giving us a rating on your podcast catcher of choice. Otherwise, back to the episode. All right, welcome back. So let's pick up where we left off. We've got Sherlock at 221B Baker Street setting up his information wall, which has conversation and has a conversation while playing chess with Mycroft about this underground terrorist cell. He sort of explains that he's got these rats or something like that, where they're sort of people that if they do certain things, it'll be an indicator that there's a plot that's happening. If this person leaves town unexpectedly, that'll be an issue. But it hasn't really made any headway on this investigation. It's just sort of set this up, and then they play a game of deduction at the end as well, which is pretty fun. There's this hat, and they both kind of sort of try and out mind power each other, which is pretty fun. And then Mrs. Hudson comes in, and we kind of cut away to a different scene. Do you have any thoughts on this little sequence here?
Let's see. There were a couple kind of really interesting things. I really wanted to laugh at calling it his information wall when he's just like taping stuff to his wall.
I didn't know what else to call it.
Like I know, like I was thinking if it was like Iron Man or something, you'd have this huge like fancy graphic screen up there or something, but not Sherlock. He just has like thumbtacks and newspaper clippings.
Yeah, like scotch tape being like a big marker.
Yeah. It's like not even like a whiteboard or a chalkboard or I mean,
just the wall
he's
above
not
the couch.
Yeah, he's not set up at all to actually like write stuff. Like it's just so interesting. Like this is where he works, and he just literally has always done this. He's just always just put stuff up wherever he needs it, and he doesn't really have like planned out. It's just weird that he doesn't have office materials. I don't know why that's bugging me, but now it's just really.
It's a thing which is it's strange. In Elementary, they have a similar kind of problem, but the way they solve it is like there's just a wall in their apartment that is the wall where like they've got it all set up and they have all the material they need to set it up properly. Sherlock, nah, just different haphazard shit every time.
Which I guess that's part of his character, so
yeah,
I should just let it roll, even though it just feels so odd. So prior to actually getting in his apartment there, we have the scene which I mentioned earlier, which is another kind of little moment where we get to understand Mary a little bit more.
Yeah.
She's making fun of John while he's shaving, and then we get the beautiful line of "I don't shave for Sherlock Holmes." And she says, "I should put that on a T-shirt."
It's such a good scene. Also, yeah, okay, I get it. I get it. You guys are writing a TV show. Fuck off. I really like this. Mary is so well written. It makes me angry how well written she is. Like it's just like Steven and Mark are really like punching above their weight with her, and then they're immediately gonna ruin it, which is exciting. But yeah, she's so great. This is a great scene.
I do have a couple of qualms. One that I had already kind of said when he does the reading on her, but they don't treat her, or they don't write her to act like a spy is the biggest problem. And I'll bring this up when they have the motorcycle scene later on. But in this actual one, the reveal that the two brothers are not actually playing chess, they are playing Operation, is beautiful and silly, and I can't decide if it's stupid or I love it.
Neither. I don't know what to make of it. It's either brilliant or it's the dumbest thing to ever happen. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Part of it is just like really appreciating the director of photography and how they framed it, and how the chessboard looks like it's between them, even though it's way in the foreground and it's not between them. And just like, I know that's what they were going for, that these two insane geniuses are playing one of the easiest children's games.
Yeah.
And that's why they're doing it. But it's also, I don't know, it's borderline silly and brilliant. And I either love, maybe I love hate it. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I think this mode of tension is going to be the show moving forward, where it's going to be like, that was either great or really, really silly, until it really jumps the shark and becomes all really silly.
But you can kind of say that about the little deduction that goes on right after that when they're tossing the hat back and forth, because it's a great scene and it's actually one of the solves that makes sense. Like, for the most part, everything that they say, aside from seeing the stray hairs, so you know he got a haircut and you know it's a he, you'd have to look real darn close on that. But I could maybe let that one slide.
It's pretty good,
but that entire scene only happened because Sherlock was trying to make a point about his brother being lonely. So it kind of plays off the Operation game, where it's like, why did they do that? They were only doing it to make a point that either they didn't want to play chess because they didn't see any challenge in it, but they see challenge in Operation, and they only wanted to play the hat game because, I don't know, the two things together just make the entire scene feel kind of odd when you sit there and think about it.
So a question I had that I wrote down here is like, what is this scene telling us about intelligence? So Mycroft is so much smarter than Sherlock, right? Like, you know, he beats him at this game of deductions, and Sherlock is the best at deductions, kind of thing. You know, that Mycroft is so much smarter, and Sherlock needling him about being lonely. My intuition is that it's sort of saying like you can have too much intelligence that means that like you can't make and sustain relationships with others really. Um, there's something happening there at like a thematic level. It's a bit blurry and yeah, I'm not really sure what to make of it yet, but it feels like there's something there about the fact that Mycroft is able to do this comes at a price, and Sherlock's able to retain a bit more of his humanity because he's not as smart, sort of thing.
Which they do touch on there, because this is the scene where they have that line that he says, if people seem slow to you, how do you think they feel to me? I live in a world of goldfish.
Yeah,
Love that
brilliant
line.
line. Yeah,
Brilliant line. But then I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, why did they have that in there? That little bit of characterization doesn't actually play into it. It doesn't take him on a character arc. It doesn't really continue anything. We have the same thing earlier where he learned an entire language in 20 minutes, and it just doesn't tie into anything.
I think it's just pure aesthetics, right? Like at a certain point, Mycroft is a really good example of where the show struggles with its tone and what it's trying to do. He is pure aesthetic. He exists to behave a type of way. He exists to contextualize Sherlock, and he exists because Mycroft is in the original source material, and they wanted to reinvent him, and have Gaddis play him, and like that is sort of the end of the thought of this character, where it's just like everything about him is very surface level, and it's very like what's happening in this scene and how should he be involved, rather than like treating him as a person or a character. I guess is my general feeling on Mycroft at all times. The other note I had written down here is I really like the line where they're talking about childhood, and Mycroft is like, both of us thought you were an idiot, Sherlock, and till we met other kids. I thought that was really, really like really sharp writing. The idea that like Mycroft is that smart. I think that conceptually is cool. Like you say, this stuff doesn't really go anywhere and isn't really paid off at all, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Or it's at least aesthetically, it's aesthetically enjoyable to watch rather than interesting. That's what I should say.
Yeah, and like that actually hit kind of hard for me, thinking about like my childhood, because my brother was 2.5 years younger, so we hung around with each other for the most part, and that was our core friend group, and going outside of that didn't really happen until middle school probably.
Yeah.
And I could have said the same thing, only it would have been like, I didn't know everyone else was normal. Like, I thought your weirdness was what everyone else was like, but no, my little brother's just weird in odd ways.
Yes. Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah. We had a similar experience, but I pretty much we had the same thing as Mycroft, where it was like, we just thought I was dumb, and then we met other kids and we were like, oh, no, okay, everyone else is a bit stupid. Pretty similar, obviously less extreme, but pretty similar experience. We just assumed everyone was as smart as we were. Turned out not to be the case. Okay, do you have anything else in this scene with Mycroft, or should we talk about John and Molly?
Nothing else about them, no.
So later, John has an ordinary day in his doctor's office with several patients. It's pretty unnotable. I think the only thing worthy of note there is that Mary is his like assistant, which is clearly how they met. Not assistant. There's a word for like receptionist, medical receptionist. Meanwhile, Sherlock asks Molly to solve crimes with him. And after several usual clients, Lestrade shows them the skeleton mystery that had been in the papers, and Sherlock quickly denounces it as a fake. Thoughts on John, and then we can talk about Molly.
I keep going back and forth as to whether or not I like Mary's role as the receptionist. And that's me thinking, I don't know if that is her taking the job because she wants to work with her future husband, or if we're supposed to infer that's how they met. And then I'm thinking, why does this ex-spy want to be a medical receptionist? Is that in her character? So it feels like it's in her character if she's doing it because she took the job to be with John. That rings so much more true than her wanting to take this career road after being an ex-spy.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm reading way more into that than the writers ever put thought into it. But still, that's what we're doing.
That's the show. If this is a surprise to you at this point, how? This is season 3. They're
Now,
3 hours. Episodes are 3 hours long. If you're like, are they reading too much into stuff? You may have missed a trick so far. It also says something about John, right? That like the 2 relationships we've seen him have are with women from work. There's something about that I think is really interesting. He doesn't. I don't know. There's something about it. It's like he doesn't really socialize outside of Sherlock, outside of whatever he's doing for a job, which was previously Sherlock, and now this medical, GP's office kind of thing.
Which you could also, it'd be interesting if she was supposed to have met him through work, then you could also say that like he consistently is getting the girls he goes after. So
yeah,
he's painted to be incompetent, yet he gets dates with so many, and not even just dates. Like Sherlock is listing off the ex-girlfriends that John has had, and he lists like 3 different people before the one that breaks up with him during that Christmas scene.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have Mary, and then we also have the first one from episode 2. So it's like he's practically a playboy, but he is written to be incompetent with women. It is so weird.
I think the idea is that he's supposed to be charming, and his bumblingness is like disarming. I don't know. There's something about the way he's written where like we're supposed to think where it's supposed to not be like. I think there's a different way you could write this character where it would come across as like womanizing, but I think they keep him bumbling and kind of incompetent to avoid that feeling of him just chasing woman after woman. Instead, it's like, no, he's like a really good guy. He's just not like good at relationships and sustaining them. Like,
well, actually, it only just now hit me that we're supposed to think the entire reason every relationship fails is because Sherlock demands all of his attention.
Yeah,
because that's what the one girl says when she leaves the Christmas party. She basically says, "This is all because you're more into Sherlock than you're into me." And anyway, I don't know why we went down the whole rabbit hole about his dating life, but
I don't know, man. We're talking about Mary and whatever.
Yeah.
Anything.
But so one thing I loved was the transitions that they do, and I can't remember if it's. I'm pretty sure it's these doctor scenes where they're transitioning immediately, like mid-word, between what John is doing and what Sherlock and what's her face are doing.
Did you just forget Molly's name? How dare you?
I did.
How dare you forget the best character?
Well, see, we have another M involved, another female M, so I think this might start happening
Mary,
a lot.
Molly, Mycroft, Moriarty. It gets a lot.
Yeah.
Morstan, Mary Morstan. It's a lot.
And it's additionally difficult because I stupidly started writing the word M when I was just writing shorthand in my notes, and that was referring to Moriarty.
Oh.
And then I started doing it for Mycroft also.
Oh no.
And then I never knew who I was who I was talking about. So the times when it takes me extra long to answer a question is because I'm like, what did I write?
Who the hell was I talking about? Self-stitch up.
But yeah, so like one of the transitions I remember was like John is putting on glasses or is putting on gloves because he has to do an exam that requires gloves, and he says cough, and then it cuts to Sherlock who someone is telling him to off. And the way those two things go together, is so beautifully cut, and I really liked how they did so many of these. It's not even just transitions; it's just showing what the two different groups of people are doing, and it's showing that Sherlock is off doing what he loves and what he is good at and what he is called to do, and John may be a doctor, but you could see he is not enjoying this version of doctoring. He wants to be the in-field doctor during the army battles.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really cool little sequence. What we didn't talk about is Sherlock going to Molly to say, hey, do you want to solve crimes together? There's this really great moment where he's like, hey, do you want to? And she says, he starts to say, do you want to? And she says, go for dinner. And then he says, solve crimes. And I love that little bit of tension where it's like, and you could see her like kind of not get deflated, but kind of like be just a little bit flummoxed. Um,
Which is
Molly,
also
yeah.
weird because she's happily engaged at that point.
Yeah,
So
listen. Let me tell you. We'll talk about that a little bit. This makes sense to me for reasons that are slightly paratextual that we find out about later. Like we kind of learn retrospectively that Molly and Sherlock had contact between now and when he faked his death. So they actually had like he actually stayed at her place for a while during that time period where he was faking his own death. And so there's something about this of like, yes, she's engaged, but also there's an implication that there's something happening there between them, or or at the very least that like there is something that could happen between them regardless of this engagement, I guess. But also, it's great to see Molly again, and she's such a good addition. And I would like to take her to dinner if Sherlock won't do it, is all I would say. So there's that too.
yeah, I love how they played her character where she knew why she was there. Like they did it in such a smart way. Like she knew that she was there to act as John in his stead. And she was trying to do what she perceived as the things that John would do in that situation. Like I don't think she cared about writing notes. She was doing it because she thought that's what Sherlock needed,
Yeah.
because that's what John did. So the entire thing, like Sherlock says that this was supposed to be a gift to her as a way to say thank you, so that she got to come on these calls and spend time with him and this kind of stuff. But she was doing it as a gift to him, giving him what she thought he needed.
Yeah.
So it's a really just nice thing that they're both in their own way doing something kind for the other person.
It's why they make a great couple, Duff. Anyway, yes, this is like Sherlock finally being like, this is him showing us what he said last season, which is that she is really important to him. This is him showing us that in the actions he's taking, and I just really fucking I just like their relationship. I think it's really wholesome. Yeah, I really enjoy this, and also I love me a bit of Molly Hooper just out and about. I think they overplay a little bit in that skeleton mystery scene. They overplay Sherlock saying John and sort of hearing John's voice and stuff. I thought that was a little bit too much.
No, that was way too much.
Yeah,
it was bad.
It's really
it
goofy and weird. And he sort of for those who haven't seen the episode, he's examining this skeleton, and he'll say something, and then John's voice and a text overlay will come up on screen, and he'll sort of like tell John to go away, or Molly will say something, and he'll say thank you, John. Like it's just really out of character, I felt.
Yeah. And even more than that, that is how in any other story you would be painting the whatever this character is. That is when you would be painting them as crazy. That is their psychology breaking moment. That is them losing touch with reality. And that's not what this story is about. So them introducing that concept, just it takes you a different way than the story is actually going, and it never fully resolves. Like Sherlock, when he finally gets back together with John, he's not like, dude, I was literally hearing voices, I was losing it. Like they don't tie this in with anything else, and it breaks what they were like. They set up that last part so beautifully where Sherlock is having Molly there to help him, and she's giving back to Sherlock, and then all of a sudden he no longer cares about her. It's all of a sudden all about John again.
Yep.
It almost feels like these scenes were like written by different people and they didn't know what the other one was writing.
It really is the embodiment of the story being in tension with the aesthetic, right? The aesthetic of Sherlock hearing these voices in the text on screen and what's actually happening in the story, they are just like clashing like this. Like it's really obvious to me, and yeah, it's a bad scene as a result. Like it doesn't make sense. It feels weird. It's noticeably out of character for him. It's noticeably out of character for Molly and for Lestrade, because Lestrade doesn't say anything about it. It's just weird. Yeah, you could cut that scene, and the episode would be far better for it, I feel.
And I do like the competency that she brings, and I've been trying to figure out if John would have done the same when she identifies the sex of the body and the age and says this is wrong because XYZ. It was like the age of the skeleton wasn't old enough or whatever it was. I can't
Yeah.
remember.
I think it was the
But
clothes in comparison to the skeleton and the other stuff around them. Like she was comparing multiple points of data, I think.
But I think what I was inferring was that because she was the morgue person that examines stuff in a different way than John as the doctor of living things examines stuff, that she was literally bringing a different point of view that Sherlock had not had on his solves before. But they didn't the filmmakers, they didn't play into that at all. It's just kind of hinted at that she was giving, you know, she was talking about skeletons and John wouldn't have been able to talk about skeletons.
Yeah.
They let that slide, and it could have been a bigger, you know, Sherlock could have been like, oh, you're extra useful. I didn't really think about that. You know?
Yeah. It's just a missed opportunity, I think. I also, if I was rewriting the scene, I also would have added a lot more tension between them. Like I would have tried to make this a bit more like added some romantic tension, and focused on that a bit more than John, because I think the reason that she can't do it again is because she is engaged, not because she is a replacement for John. And confusing those reasons this scene confuses those reasons and conflates them together. And I think it's a real missed opportunity to grow these characters together and to show us a bit more of like that Sherlock is capable of like a romantic relationship, which we do get. Don't get me wrong. Like I understand what the next episode is about, but yeah, I think it's a real missed opportunity. This little sequence here. Do you have anything else there, or should we talk about the Howard Chilcott stuff?
Yes, I had an amazing, mind-blowing insight that I've utterly forgotten.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, but I only got it 10 seconds ago, so I haven't really lost all that much. Let's see. We're talking about Molly, and then Sherlock waking them up. Okay, I'm just gonna give up on it.
Would you give up after 3, Darth? We said the name of the show. Roll credits. Okay, so hang on. I can't tell if it's raining or not. Oh no, I'm good. I was like, my laundry is going to be in trouble, but it's fine. Okay. So they also go and talk to a client, Howard Chilcott, who works for the London Underground. His job is to clear security footage after each day, but he noticed someone get into a car on the tube but not get out at the other end. Sherlock recognizes the man in the security footage as one Lord Moran, but is unable to deduce how he appeared. Now, the first note I have is, at this point, Darth is going to explain to me how security footage works and automatically erases itself after a certain time, and that clearing the footage as a job doesn't really exist, is what I've written down here.
Ironically, I did not make that note. Now, it could go both ways. Because we actually like sell these like DVRs at work for security stuff, and like we'll install the cameras and stuff. And a lot of people will prefer it where they don't have to automatically delete stuff, because anything that you could automate is better for the most part. Mm-hmm. But I could also see it being part of someone's job, specifically for whatever security that might be more vital than just making sure that your place isn't broken into. But you might need to literally have a physical human review the footage, because that's the only way to see if someone is stealing stuff, if they're walking with merchandise out the back door. Nothing is going to catch that. You have to scrub through the footage. So it actually didn't track that this was anything odd. The only thing that might track, now that I'm thinking about it, is him noticing this, because you would be scrubbing through this so fast, 20 times, 30 times speed, whatever, that although if he's looking at this type of footage all the time, and there was only the one dude getting on the train car, and so he noticed that, but at the same time, then he's going back and forth between 2 different stations, so he would be reviewing the footage at one station complete and then stopping, and then he would review the footage at the next station. So practically it doesn't work probably, but I would not go CinemaSins on that one. And I feel
Interesting.
like that's.
I was sure you would. I was so sure.
I know.
I was like, I've anticipated him. I've cut him off at the part. Fuck, damn it. Damn it. The
I'm
Padawan
gonna
has
say
become the
that
master.
I'm gonna say that I'm learning and growing, and as a result of everything you're teaching me, I'm not harping on the things maybe I would have harped on before.
Damn it. I'll take the L. That's fine. Look, this. Talk to me about the scene.
I remembered the thing that I wanted to say before, and I don't know how much this is interesting, but it just hit me as really interesting that the entire skeleton scene, with as weird as it felt, doesn't make sense in the larger context, because it was set up by Anderson to prove that Sherlock was alive, but at this point Anderson already knows that Sherlock is alive. Now we could infer that Anderson set this up like months ago, so in the timeline it still might logically work.
Yeah, it was on the newspaper that Mycroft was reading when Sherlock was getting shaved.
Yeah, but see, in the context of the story, in the order that it's being told, it doesn't make sense. Like, this scene should have happened before the public found out that Sherlock was alive. Then it would have made sense, but because it happens after, the reveal that it was set up by Anderson doesn't track to me.
It also doesn't add anything to the story. This scene is just an unforced error. Like, I don't know how else to explain. This is just an unforced error, the whole thing.
Well, I think it could have added something if they had done it early enough, because it would have shown that the I don't remember what they called their little clique, the Sherlockites, but it would have shown that they're not just this crazy group of people, that they maybe it would have enforced that they're a crazy group of people because they're going out and stealing stuff from museums, or they bought it at auction, whatever they did, but they went to all this trouble to set up this thing in order to prove this thesis that they had. So it adds another layer of depth and complexity to them, which is also saying something about us, the audience, because, you know, those people who set this up is the stand-in for the writers looking at the audience members doing all this stuff on the internet. So this scene being in there is a direct reflection of the audience. And is it good or bad? Because this is more in depth. This is better done than the silly, you know, the way they dress the goth girl and the nerds and the jokes about the hats. So, like, this is giving the audience credibility almost in a way that the earlier scene didn't.
Which, if you were going to resequence this, you would put this moment right before we then cut to that sequence to be like, here's the credibility, and then here's the goofy outcome of that credibility. And I think it would have been a bit less insulting if you kind of sequenced it that way. I think that scene is just like bad. Like, I think sometimes, and this is like the challenge, this is why I was worried about the show moving forward and why I had so much trouble with this episode, is this is, when I say unforced error, what I mean is, like, this is a kind of mistake that, like, these are like seasoned TV writers. They shouldn't be making these kinds of errors anymore. It's like when you get to pros in tennis, like, there are certain unforced errors you shouldn't be double faulting on a serve, right? Your second serve should always go in. These are just like, you should be practiced enough at this, and this is one of those scenes where you go, how do you get at this? And it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's wrong for the episode it's in. It's in the wrong part of the episode. It's wrong for the story they're telling. It's wrong for the characters that are in it. It's not good. This also then. Sorry, do you have anything else on that, or do we want to talk? Because I also have some notes on the Howard Chilcott moment as well.
In the midst of them looking at the footage, Sherlock kind of goes into his mind palace as he's trying to figure out where the subway's going, and as he's trying to remember who the face is that looks familiar to him. And it harkened back to something in episode 1, when they're chasing down the cab, and he briefly goes into his mind palace, although we don't see it identified as that at the time. But in his mind, he mentally is mapping out on all of the streets. If the cabbie goes here, it hits a red light, so I need to take this side alley and blah, blah, blah. And something really interesting that I read, that explains that is like that's a real thing. Like, and I don't remember what they called it, but it was like a test that the cabbies in London have to take
Yeah.
because they have to like actually memorize all of these maps and know all of these side streets. So if their way is blocked, they know the most efficient way because GPS didn't exist for so long. So they developed this thing.
Hmm.
And so it makes the Mind Palace so much less mystical just to realize that Sherlock studied and took a test and memorized an existing structure that takes away the mysticism. So it's the same thing with this subway thing. Like it's not that crazy. Like there are maps. He looked at the maps and he has a good memory, you know?
Yes. My problem is how fucking goofy it is. This Mind Palace lasts like 15 seconds, and it's so like it's almost embarrassing to watch. Like in retrospect, like I watched this and just went it's just it's I think especially in the from the context of the previous scene, it's just like I was already pulled out of it, and this just to me was like really cringy. It lasts way too long. And not only that, we don't get the solve. We just cut to John. So like we spend like 15 seconds watching this really goofy like moment, and then we don't even get to know what happens. We just cut away. And I'm like, well, why didn't we just cut away while like I just it's baffling. I don't understand this decision. Yeah, didn't like it.
Yeah.
Personal taste, but didn't like it.
And it's a really weird cut too because that goes directly into him being outside Sherlock's being outside 221B, and he's trying to face what it's going to be like when he walks back in there, and then he gets the needle stabbed and he gets kidnapped. So it goes from Sherlock attempting to do a solve to introducing like the beginning of the climax.
And I don't understand why, because we then cut back to the solve. We then cut back to like that's already resolved and we're just moving on. Like it doesn't. Yeah, it's weirdly sequenced.
It almost makes me think that the editors just didn't know how to fit that scene in. They couldn't figure out where to have. They know they need to show John getting kidnapped, but they didn't know where to put it in the story. And so right after the John gets it's really weird because after the John gets kidnapped scene, it cuts immediately to Sherlock, who's still thinking about the subway stuff, and Molly goes up talking to him about it.
Yeah.
And just the flow of it is just so weird.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why I dislike that Mind Palace moment even more, is that it like not only did it pull me out, but then I was suddenly noticing how awkward the sequence was. And not only that, this is the second time John has been drugged at the door of 221B Baker Street and abducted. Like literally from that exact spot. That's happened before. Like all he is gonna do from now until the end of the show is get kidnapped. Like that is his role now. It's the damsel in distress.
Yep.
And it made me sigh when it happened. Okay, let me set up the next little sequence here. I was gonna say too, at Howard Chilcott's place, Molly and Sherlock have some really great chemistry, where they're sort of, they have a bit of an unspoken bond where Chilcott's saying some stuff and they give each other these looks of like this fucking guy. It's cool. I like it.
Of course, I brought it up earlier, but they say it again. He was like, he reiterates, "You mattered the most. That's how I was able to live."
Yeah.
And I still, every time I hear it now, I'm like, I want to know why. Like, I actually don't even need to know the solve. Like, that's not necessarily the point. But it was like, the only thing that it could have been is that she had a body for him to fake, or she faked his death by faking the medical records. Like, that's logically the only thing she could have done.
Oh, duh.
But why did that?
Don't you worry, we'll get to it.
Okay.
We'll get to it. I have that's my next notes are on exactly that. That's my next big topic. We got a little bit to get through before when we revisit the conspiracy theorists. We'll delve into that a bit. Okay, so back near the skeleton crime scene, Molly it's revealed to us that Molly's engaged, and she can't do anything like this again. And Sherlock basically thanks her for helping, as you say, thanks her for helping fake his death. So I really, really, really like this scene. There is some really great dialogue. I like the character growth. One of my favorite lines is from Sherlock, where he says, "All the men you fall for can't all turn out to be sociopaths, right?" And she's like, "Maybe it's just my type." And I was really not. That's a really good line. Sherlock's character growth here, he is like a completely different person than he was last season. Like the ability for him to have this conversation is like he has come such a long way from where he was, and it would have been a really interesting season of television to see him go through that growth. I think I'm once again left with this problem of this thing that Steve continues to do as showrunner. You know, he did this with the Doctor, where the Doctor became this retired professor. This is the same maneuver. It's like a main character has a huge arc that we never see on screen that would have been a far more interesting piece of television than what we're permitted to see. It's just, I don't know why he keeps doing it. That being said, like, I'll be honest, I do really like this moment. It's deeply humanizing for both of them. There is this, like, tragic, ill-timed romance thing happening here, which I also appreciate. And we'll talk about it a little bit toward the end of season 4, and I guess, like, what this means for the show at large. But I do really, really like this moment. It's just a shame that it is hampered by the classic Moffat maneuver in a way that seems inescapable for him as a showrunner. It is, and I get it, it's far harder to write characters changing on screen than to just say, oh yeah, they had growth off screen, don't worry about it. But unfortunately, as the viewer, the one watching the show, it has to be interesting to watch. Being told someone's changed is far less interesting than seeing them change or seeing why they're changing. But yeah, I like this scene. Molly's great. Any notes on this, or?
Nope.
All right, well, let's talk about, I guess, the climax. Mary received a text message that tells her John has been taken. She goes to Sherlock, who realizes the place John is being held at is St. James the Lesser Church. Mary explains that it's a skip code, and this is what leads to that revelation. He and Mary commandeer a motorcycle to get to the church, where they rescue John from being burned alive in the bonfire for Guy Fawkes Night. I'm going to CinemaSins this really quickly, because it's implied that the bomb stuff is happening on Guy Fawkes Night, but this burning of the thing is like not the same day. So like it's nighttime now, and they're burning the Guy Fawkes effigy, and then later on it's like, well, the bombing is when the bill is being heard, which is the 5th of November, which is Guy Fawkes Night. So why are they burning this effigy early? Very confusing. Anyway, I noticed that and I was like, oh, what? Just weird. Okay.
I don't know if it's the same thing elsewhere, but our 4th of July celebration, our Independence Day celebration, we will have, which is July 4th, right? We will have fireworks in our town, like we have 2 towns butting right up next to each other. So we'll have fireworks in one town on the 3rd, fireworks in the next town on the 4th, and maybe fireworks somewhere else on the 5th. So okay. They'll actually spread them out just so, because you have too many clusters of people to get everyone together at the one place. Okay. So it's weird, but it's also logical.
Okay. See, it's just interesting because that stuff doesn't happen here at all. So I have absolutely no real life context for like what this stuff looks like. Yeah, interesting. I've already noted this down, but John is the damsel in distress again. Awesome. He doesn't like get up or anything. I understand that he's been drugged, but like, so I've written down here to borrow one of your questions. Why does the person who kidnapped John text Mary? Why does this happen? What does this do for the story? It doesn't make a lot of logical or emotional sense. Like, why would they contact Mary? Is it a test to see if Sherlock can save him? Maybe. Possibly. Knowing where the season goes, I think that's the implication. I also realize it's foreshadowing for Mary. She knows what a skip code is. That's neat. But this whole plot beat, it's very odd. And it's just strange.
Yeah, this is something that I don't think makes sense until we review the next episode, and even then I can't remember if it fully explains this or not, because it's just so weird. Like, the only reason that he would have sent that to Mary was to force the issue so that Sherlock knows, or Sherlock suspects, that she is an ex-spy. That would be the only reason for that to happen.
Which seems to be the maneuver. But we
And
also,
then
yeah, but like we also don't know
and then
what the plan. Like we don't know how that would affect the major villain's plan, and it never really comes back in any way.
yeah, like from what I gathered, the only reason that he had John kidnapped was because he wanted to see how Sherlock reacted to John being kidnapped, but it doesn't give him any useful data that I could tell.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from like being able to, maybe that was the only time that he was able to observe how much Sherlock cared about John, which he knew that then he could use John as leverage. But before, maybe he didn't know if John was actually cared about or John was just like a sidekick work, maybe he was just a work dude and Sherlock didn't actually care about him. So maybe this entire thing was just to get leverage on Sherlock, and he had to test whether that leverage would actually work or not.
Yeah,
and
okay.
for anyone who has not seen the next episode, this entire explanation was going to be confusing.
Yep. Yeah, it's yeah, we try not to spoil anything ahead of time, but this is just like off the back of 3 really confusing scenes. This is like another one where I'm just like, what is happening? Yeah, this is a very muddled sequence. So the idea here is that this is unrelated completely to the bomb. This is just like a coincidence that this happens at the same time. Like, this has nothing to do with the plot of the episode. This is setting up stuff for later, I guess, is the only conclusion that I've been able to come to.
Yeah, which they actually say, but they don't say that until like the very end of the episode. So it's a lot easier for that line to just fly over people's heads, because it's like literally in the conclusion, and John looks over at him and he's like, why was I kidnapped? How did that tie in? And Sherlock is like, I don't know. I don't like not knowing. And that's all we get out of it.
I don't listen. Not every moment in a story has to be in service of the main plot, but this feels tangential as it's happening. Like this, like the fact that it gets resolved and then they just go back to like talking about everything else. Like they just go back to talking about Lord Moran. It's just weird. I don't know. Yeah, it doesn't feel like it belongs, and in doing so, it feels more like a loose thread than it should.
Well, another interesting thing is that it is tied into the main plot, and the fact that this was a Guy Fawkes burning, which I need to look up why they do that if that's actually a thing, because that just seems really weird now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
But regardless, that was part of the solve for them figuring out that the bad guys were gonna blow up Parliament, was because John was hidden underneath this burning thing for Guy Fawkes. So they were like, oh, 5th of November, it all ties together. But then it turns out it doesn't tie together. So was it a coincidence, or was the villain trying to
give Sherlock a piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, the completely unrelated villain, completely unrelated scheme, and he's like, oh, I'm going to throw you a bone just because I like to see you play with the bone. I don't know.
Yeah, man, I don't know. But again, I mean, it's this universe's conceptualization of villainy, which is super smart, and nothing you do has to make sense because you're a crazy villain. You know, it's that same mode of storytelling.
So going off of that, it's kind of an interesting lead-in to talk about Mary real quick, and like the writer's conceptualization of what they perceived an ex-spy to be and what she would do. And I wish that they had her be the one who like knocks the rider off of the motorcycle and like physically takes the motorcycle, and she's like, get on, we're going. She drives. She is an expert driver, which is, triggers, and Sherlock is like, why do you know how to drive like this? Like you're literally too good to be real. And then she could, whether or not he's the one navigating or she is both navigating, interpreting the codes and driving one-handed all at the same time. Like that would have been such better characterization but they can't do that. Sherlock has to be the one who's in charge all
Yeah.
the time, and it is just so annoying when she is supposed to be this awesome character and she's not built up to have the powers that she is supposed to have.
Until the plot demands that she has them.
Yep.
Yep. And it is, yeah, it is frustrating. And like, I let women ride motorcycles, Steve. Like, what's going on here? Like, I don't. It's fine. She can be a fucking badass. Like, that's cool, man. It's fine. She could just do that. Yeah, it is oddly disappointing, is what I would say. All right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want to. I don't want to infer that like every female secret agent or whatever is supposed to be like Trinity, and they're all supposed to have the same skill set. I mean, obviously, like this secret agent may have been a super, unique brand of spy that only is there to assassinate people, and she's always undercover, so she doesn't know how to do other stuff. That's fine. It just feels like a missed opportunity for giving her character more agency and developing her a little bit more. But I definitely don't want to infer that she should be exactly the same as Trinity, because that's exactly who I was picturing in my head when I pictured this scene was the motorcycle scene with Trinity.
Yeah. No, I agree. I just think it's a missed opportunity to add some extra characterization. Okay, so should we talk about I guess the quote unquote solve of this episode? So back in 221B, Sherlock is talking to his parents in his living room. When John comes in, Sherlock's parents leave, and Sherlock and John talk about what happened the previous evening. Sherlock tells John about the underground network in London and realized that the terrorist plot is related to Lord Moran's disappearance. And he deduces that Lord Moran had not disappeared, but the entire car had. Sherlock then confirms with Shilcott that between the stations that Moran had disappeared in was a station that had never opened on Sumatra Road, basically under Parliament. And the idea here is that like this train car must be a bomb that is going to destroy Parliament, right? So there's a few things that happen here. I think it's very funny to imagine Sherlock just having some normal ass parents as well. Like they're just normal people, and they have these two like uber smart kids. I thought was really fun.
Well, I mean, it's also interesting that and I think Sherlock actually says it in here, and he's like, yeah, they each have like 3 degrees, and they've written 18 books apiece.
Yeah.
But it's the type of intellect is just so different. It's like they have functional intellect, and he and his brother have dysfunctional intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know a better way to phrase that. But
No, I think that's a really efficient way of saying it. Yeah. This kind of goes back to what we were saying before about Mycroft's intelligence and the fact that he can't really have relationships, right? Like, this is sort of refracting that a little bit and being like, here is the healthy version of this intelligence.
and they play that they play off of that a couple times in here where Mycroft is trying to bribe him to take his parents to the opera or whatever, and then he physically calls Sherlock while he's at the play and says, "Oh, this is awful. This is the worst thing ever." And I'm like, dude, it's Les Mis. It's one of the best musicals ever written. Why are you complaining?
My guys out here just can't appreciate art, you know? So goofy. So goofy. I also like as John comes in, Sherlock makes them leave, and then John's reaction to it is perfect, where he just like he doesn't know how to react at all. Like he just cannot he's like he just doesn't know what to do with this information that it's his parents. I thought that was brilliant. The idea that Sherlock Holmes has parents is so foreign that you don't know what to do with it. I thought was really cool.
And this is such a tiny thing, but I just realized it. Okay, disclaimer, I am like mildly colorblind, but y'all have to confirm that this is true, but I'm pretty sure that they cast his mom to have the same shade of blue as Sherlock's eyes are. They both have the same like light striking blue eyes, and it's such a good casting choice.
Mm-hmm.
Although I don't know how much you would actually notice that unless it's just a subconscious thing.
Maybe.
But I love the casting of those two. I mean, you could see intelligence about them, but they're just so down to earth and old people-ish.
Yeah, they just have a real parent vibe that's hard to explain.
Yeah.
Something else I really like is that Underground Network is like a cool language twisty thing that Moffat does sometimes, and I think it works really well here, where it's an underground network of like, it's an underground network in the sense of like it's a secret conspiracy, but it's also literally an underground network that they're using to do it. It's very Moffat aesthetic, and I think it works. It works really well here. Like that it is a double meaning, and both meanings track and aren't called attention to. I think it's pristine Steve Moffat at his best.
I cannot remember what episode it is, but I swear there was an episode of Doctor Who where it was this literal thing where the Doctor was like, "It's exactly what he said it was," and that was the solve.
Yeah.
But
It's
that would make
something
sense.
Steve does a lot, and I like it. It works well here. Sometimes it can be really too much and on the nose, but yeah, it's good here. Okay, so do you have any notes on this sequence, or should we kind of go underground and go and find the bomb?
I don't actually have any notes. I'm just kind of like scrubbing through the footage to see. So they are talking to their buddy again, and he's helping them find this extra secret subway station that's underneath, that's not on any maps or anything. And in the midst of this, it's cutting back and forth to who we've now identified as the bomber, who is this politician or whatever. And it's just kind of funny how he's just casually lounging in bed at a fancy motel with the bomb key codes, in a suitcase right beside him. And he's just kind of sitting here. He's like, I might murder some people today. I might get takeout.
Yeah,
too. I
might get
really
some Chinese food. I don't know what's up. Yeah, let's see what happens. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, like his characterization as what we now see as being the prime villain of the show, and he does not look the part. He does not look nervous. He does not look evil. He's like literally just a businessman lounging at his hotel room. And it's just so weird. Like he's clean shaven. He's got his hair styled. He's got on a nice shirt. It's nothing that you would attribute to someone who has evil actions. He's calm. It's odd.
It's especially odd in the context of the show where villainy presents in a very specific affectation, right? Like yes, everyone in the show dresses well and like wears suits and stuff, but like they have an affectation to them. Like Moriarty is a type of way. The cabbie was a type. Like villains express villainy. Like they are so villainous that it cannot help but leak out of them in weird ways and in certain expressions. And this is just a guy, just a dude. Like it's curious, isn't it? I mean, I guess in no small part because this episode isn't interested in him as a villain. It's interested in the idea of the plot, and this bomb. It cares very little about why it's being done and who is doing it. It's just a vehicle to get John and Sherlock back together. Okay, well, let me set up the little sequence underground here. So Sherlock decides there must be a bomb in the car, and he and John go to an underground station where they break into the tunnels to try and find the bomb. John tries to call the police in order to warn the members of Parliament who are about to start their anti-terrorism bill meeting, but Sherlock doesn't let him. When they find the car, they realize that the car is not carrying a bomb, it is the bomb. The entire compartment is wired with explosives. While Sherlock and John are in the car, the timer set for 2 minutes and 30 seconds commences. Lord Moran has set the bomb remotely from his room. Knowing they have no time to get out before the bomb detonates, the two try and find a way to disarm the bomb, but even Sherlock's mind palace doesn't hold the answer of how to defuse a bomb. John then tells Sherlock that he was the wisest man he has ever known, and then they brace for death. And then we hard cut, which I'll pick up in a second. So yeah, look, I've written down here that this moment in the tunnels is when I finally started to come to terms with what the show is going to be moving forward, which is to say, I finally went, okay, I guess this is just silly now, and that's fine. And I remember I was literally sitting there on the couch being like, yep, okay. And I tried to switch my brain off and still couldn't, but at the very least, I'm less worried than I was. I've come to terms with it at this point in the episode. So, Yeah, there's a moment where we spend like 20 seconds in the tunnels through these like little montage, and Sherlock is like, "Hey, there's nowhere else it could be." Um, he then, he then literally does mind powers by touching. This is so stupid. He touches his fingers to his head, and like concentrates really hard because this show is a cartoon now, and that's how he works out like where the bomb is he just like really concentrates really hard, and it's just like really embarrassing. And then the line, this is not CinemaSins, this is just, I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm pretty sure that saying, oh yeah, it's perfectly safe as long as we avoid touching the rails, like the railway tracks. I don't know how like railway lines work in like England, but here the power is overhead, it's not on the tracks itself. Wasn't sure how that works in other countries though.
Yeah, I have absolutely heard the same thing, but it's always been in movies. So I would agree that I don't know how realistic it is, even though it's portrayed really consistently.
Might just be one of those like cinematic language things.
Actually, no. I remember I saw a clip on Reddit of this. This is, I can't believe I'm making this reference. There was a monkey who was trying to resuscitate his friend who had gotten electrocuted because it touched the rails.
Yeah.
And this probably would have been like India or something, because most places don't have just monkeys like running around. But point of that, in some places there are definitely electrified rails, but whether or not they would have been in that location does feel like it's enough of a CinemaSins thing where I would let that one slide, even though I love when writers will go the extra mile to be sure that they are being extremely realistic and accurate with, you know, every location that they are writing in. Because that line doesn't need to be there. You don't need to add extra. The only reason the line is there is to add extra danger and extra tension. It's like, the bomb might blow us off, but also if you touch this, you'll also get electrocuted. So they're just adding extra levels of death tension for no reason.
Yeah, it doesn't add anything.
It's like the only... Like, I would have not been shocked at all if the lasers from the snipers suddenly appeared on them. It's like, now we've got 3 levels of potential death. Like, that's what these writers like to do.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, that's I hadn't thought of it as that kind of escalation maneuver, but yeah, that is certainly what this is. Sherlock doing that like concentraty thing really just, boy howdy.
Now, I'm back and forth between defending it as something that he's always done and saying that it sometimes feels realistic. Because I could probably scrub through this footage and see what I'm thinking, and I'll like unconsciously like touch my head sometimes. And I could probably quote Professor X, who does that all the time in certain versions of his character.
Yes, but it lasts too long, and it just... Yeah. I have no articulate way of explaining why I dislike it here, other than it lasts a bit too long, and I was already out of the episode, and this episode's had a bunch of goofy shit like this in it, and it just... I saw it and went, oh great, more of this.
Yeah. I mean, now I'm going back and forth, and as I think probably what they were trying to do is that they need a physical representation of when he is going into his mind palace versus when he is just thinking.
Yes.
And if they don't have an extremely obvious physical cue, then it's harder for the audience to get inside his head and understand the character. That being said, I interpret everything that happened from the moment they went underground to be staged. So every time that Sherlock did this, it was staged for John's benefit.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So given that, you could say that he was play acting and he was doing it over the top just to mess with John.
Interesting.
I don't know if that makes it better in your eyes, because it's still cringy, but it's intentionally cringy.
My issue is I think my issue is I was out of the show by that point, and it stuck out to me as another piece of a larger puzzle. Whether or not that reading is interesting and probably excuses it a bit more. I hadn't really thought of it that way, to be honest. But that is curious. I just don't like it. I think the show has a tendency to think things are cooler than they are, and then in execution you look at them and you go like, this is that you guys should have paid a little bit more nuance to this and it would have been perfect. It's always a bit like blunt, like first strike at everything is the way some of this stuff feels. Is maybe the best way to articulate that.
Well, I think, I never given it much thought before now, but I think one reason that it's never bothered me is because I just see so much Professor X in that, or anyone that uses telepathy or whatever. You see them physically touch themselves all the
Yeah.
time, so it's just kind of,
But that's
you
also
know,
literally a mind power.
that that is definitely what the writers were going for, though. Like,
Yeah.
Sherlock is a superhero. He has superpowers, and it's his mind.
Yeah.
I don't know if that excuses anything or if it just helps us get into the mind of what the writers were trying to do. I don't know.
Yeah.
I will give you another sins
Oh,
thing,
good.
though, is the train is the bomb. The train explodes. All of the fire goes up the shaft, but and then that shaft leads up to Parliament and blows up the entire building, right? But they go past the shaft, look up in it, and it's completely filled with explosives already. So the train isn't the bomb. The bombs are in the shaft. So stopping the bombs inside the train, how does that stop the bombs inside the shaft?
I,
Unless they only go off because the bomb is what sets them off. So the bomb on the train goes off, and it secondarily explodes all these bombs in the shaft. But either way, it just was so weird that they put that shot of those bombs up there while in the same scene saying the train is the bomb when
I,
they saw physical bombs.
I think it's the same thing you were talking about just before. Like, I think it's that adding extra tension thing. Like, I don't think it exists for any other reason than to, like, up the stakes. I don't know. Yeah.
Or it was something from like an early draft of the script where they had like before they wrote the line "the train is the bomb," they were just going to have bombs at multiple points all through the rail system. I
I don't know. I have no idea.
Either way, this entire scene underground is fraught with many issues.
Yes, I totally agree with that. So, okay. Sherlock, there's a few things that happen here pretty quickly back to back. I want to just say that, so Sherlock is pretending not to know how to defuse the bomb. I need to explain this next sequence. Here's the thing. There's two things that happen here and they're not related. One of them is what happens in the tube car. Then the other one is back with Anderson and the Conspiracy Theorist Club. I don't know the best way to talk about this sequence because they don't really have a lot to do with each other necessarily. The Anderson stuff leads into the other research I did for this episode. Maybe what we'll do, let's talk, and this is slightly out of sequence, but let's talk about the train car bomb defusal and the resolution to that. And then let's backtrack and talk about the conspiracy theorists because I think that'll take us into the end of the episode nicely.
Yeah, because this is completely out of order, and there's no reason for it to be done this way.
So back in so we cut away. We have this whole sequence with the theorists. Then we come back to the tube car. Sherlock and John are preparing for their final moments. Sherlock begins to cry and then starts laughing. And John looks down and sees the timer has been stopped since 1 minute and 29 seconds and is oscillating. Sherlock can stop the bomb and says there was an off switch. John is obviously miffed. We then see people with torches coming down the tunnel. And John realizes Sherlock also called the police, so it was like a double bluff for some reason. And this was a manipulation by Sherlock to get John to admit how much he missed him. What I've written in my notes is like, John should not be in this relationship. This is really abusive. Sherlock is basically gaslighting him into forgiving him. It's fucking bizarre.
Wow.
Yeah. It's so toxic.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, it's so funny. Yeah, so that we get that resolution. They've defused the bomb, which is fine. And then obviously Lord Moran tries to escape, but he gets arrested. Cool. So we'll talk a little bit about the end of the episode in a second. Do you have any thoughts on, I guess, this fake bomb defuse? I mean, you obviously kind of already highlighted the idea that he was acting the whole time, which is an interesting reading I hadn't really considered. Is there anything else you want to touch on there?
Another thing to add on to the acting the whole time was that when the cops come running up, And John says, "Oh, you did call them," and Sherlock's like, "Of course I called them." So that was a big thing. Is like, we didn't even call the police. Now everyone's gonna die. So there were so many layers of Sherlock lying to him here, and it did not occur to me how toxic this relationship is. And I don't know how I'm gonna go on watching this now that you've made that connection for me.
Once you see it, you can never not be like, oh my god.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you could maybe argue that this had to happen in order for John to truly forgive Sherlock, but I don't know why, because he is there. And if he hadn't forgiven him, he wouldn't be there. He would still be angry, and he wouldn't have shaved. He would have kept doing his own thing, just out of stubbornness to admit that I'm not going to shave. I don't need Sherlock, and I don't need that job. I'm going to stay with Mary. So,
Yeah.
but the bigger issue that I have this was yet another assassination on his character, because I loved his point of view where he says, we can't run away, or Sherlock tells him to run, and he's like, I can't run away. We have to solve this, or everyone is going to die, and that will be our fault because we didn't call the cops and because we didn't solve this. So we can't run. We have to solve it. And then instead of trying to solve it, he just goes on this little baby rant where he's like mortified by his own death, and he's trying to apologize to Sherlock when he just said the reason he's staying is because he has to be a hero and save people. And then he immediately stops trying to save people and stops trying to solve the problem in any actual physical way. And I cannot explain how much that annoyed me about his character. Like, he does the right thing and then immediately stops doing the right thing.
Yep. Yep. Because John's entire character is the show saying he's one type of way and then never letting us see him be that type of way. Like, they're always like, he's this calm, strong guy under pressure. And the second there's any pressure, he just crumbles. Like, every time. Yeah. It's not good. They just have no idea what to do with him, it seems. Like, it doesn't matter what the context, they just have no idea what to do with John Watson. Aside from queerbait him and have him be kidnapped. Those seem to be the two options. He's either crying and not doing his job properly, he's being kidnapped, or he's being queerbaited. And it's like, I feel like for one of the most famous characters in literature, you could probably do a bit more with him, maybe. Yeah, not great. Sherlock knows how to defuse a bomb, I guess. That's the reason this episode resolves, is he knows how to defuse a bomb. Or there's an off switch or whatever. I don't have any issues with it. I just think it's noteworthy that this is a skill he has.
Yeah, well, and I could potentially let that go because it's not made clear whether he knew ahead of, well, I guess he said they always have an off switch. So that would infer that he's studied this kind of stuff before. I had always thought that he just looked at it and was like, oh, there's a switch.
I mean, if you make this is the thing, like, if, like, it's a pretty common thing with terrorism. You'll hear Robert Evans talk about it a lot in his books about, like, internet terrorism and, like, the radicalization of people online and stuff like that into actual terrorists. Yeah, you do always have an off switch for this kind of stuff because, like, it's a very deliberate kind of plan, a deliberate kind of mindset where you always have a plan B in place. Doesn't matter what the context is. And so, yeah, this is one of those things that, like, you can tell that Moffat and Gaddis had done some research here. This is, like, a thing that just is true for a lot of the time with devices like this. But, yeah, it also just kind of implies that, like, as you say, Sherlock studied this. This isn't surprising. He's got all these kind of crazy things he's catalogued and studied. It would be weird if he didn't know how to defuse a bomb, in my opinion. Like, at a certain
Although
point.
that kind of ties back into, what was it, episode 2? Which one was this? No, 3, the swimming pool one.
Yeah, season 1, episode 3.
The bomber is going around blowing up stuff, and at one point John is like, be careful when you pick up the shoe, the dude's a bomber. And so we don't necessarily have this insight that Sherlock knows all about bombs, which is what this scene seems to indicate. So it would have been nice if they had somehow tied those 2 episodes together to show that he has done all this research about bomb making and stuff. I mean, we could infer it. We see a little bit of evidence with him knowing about the off switch, but it doesn't tie together back with that other story at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we should talk about the conspiracy theorists then. And then we'll talk about the ending of the episode. So Sherlock, basically the way this actually plays out is they brace for death, and then we cut to Sherlock being recorded by a camera. He explains how he faked his death. He and Mycroft had allowed Moriarty to destroy Sherlock's reputation because they needed to learn about Moriarty's network. Then, since Sherlock had set up the final meeting place on the roof, there had been 13 possible things that could have happened. He and Mycroft cased the roof and set up a solution for each scenario, with the code word for each one. The only one that wasn't expected was Moriarty shooting himself. So after this happens, Sherlock texts the word Lazarus to Mycroft, and the homeless network bystanders moved into position. A group of men deployed a giant air cushion directly below Sherlock's position on the roof, and the street had been closed off to the public. Since John was behind the shorter ambulance station below, he could not see the air cushion. As Anderson had correctly speculated, Molly Hooper was involved in the plan. Sherlock points out that Moriarty had found a way to traumatize one of the kidnapped children from Sherlock's last case into thinking Sherlock was the kidnapper, which allowed Sherlock to realize that perhaps Moriarty had achieved this by using an accomplice who happened to bear a unique resemblance to Sherlock, and this accomplice was killed as soon as he had exceeded his usefulness. This meant the morgue had a body on hand to pass off as Sherlock, with the real Sherlock supplying the necessary coat. Once Sherlock jumped onto the air mattress, he and the rest of the group ran the opposite way around the ambulance station while John was walking toward Bart's. John saw the fake body and then was knocked down by the bicyclist. Once John had got back up, Sherlock had been covered in fake blood, then taken the place of the body on the pavement and put a rubber ball under his armpit in order to stop his pulse shortly while the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance. Anderson is in fact the one recording the explanation. After the video was finished, Sherlock says that he had not come to explain, he'd come to talk about the skeleton mystery, which he knew Anderson had organized with the help of his fan club. Sherlock then berates Anderson for distracting him, almost causing the deaths of countless innocents and the destruction of Parliament. Anderson wonders about loopholes in Sherlock's solution and explanation, and then wonders if he'd ever been told the true way Sherlock had faked his death. And then he turns around and Sherlock is gone. And it's unclear if Sherlock was ever really there. So, okay. This sequence is cool, and I like the way it's shot. It's really stylistically interesting. As you said before, it has that Mission Impossible feel to it, but it's deeply indulgent. It is a deliberate cutaway from the tension of the moment, and is about the. So this fits aesthetically, right? We think John and Watson might be about to die, and then we get the story of Sherlock's resurrection. So like, I can see how the writers positioning this moment in the text would have perceived this to be related to the mortal jeopardy that Sherlock and John are in. If they're about to die, we get the story of Sherlock's resurrection confirmed or not confirmed or like unclear. But it bears aesthetic resemblance. It has no actual thematic relationship. And I think that's interesting and notable. I like Anderson finding the explanation disappointing and then breaking down, but then it's unclear if this explanation was real or if Anderson's just losing his mind. And this is really where they kind of bury the hatchet in the back of the fan reading. Where like, this is really them saying, like, Anderson's losing his mind, he's crazy, you'll never really know what happens, sort of thing. I'll talk about some other stuff in a second, but do you think this is the real explanation? What's your take on how we're supposed to interpret this?
Until I've been discussing those with you, I had never even entertained the possibility that this was not real. Everything that we see, the problem is that the filmmakers lied to us a whole lot with what they show on screen being the actual truth. But we see a close-up as Anderson goes back and he's looking at the wall and he's saying that doesn't make sense because of this and this and this, and then it cuts to Sherlock and he like rolls his eyes and then he looks at his watch, and then in the background over Anderson's shoulder we see Sherlock walk out of the room. Given all of that, there is no way in my mind that this was not a real scene with Sherlock literally there, and he literally gave that explanation to Anderson because he is, I assume, because he made his peace with Molly, right? So this is him making his peace with Anderson.
Yep.
It tracks with everything else that we've seen. I don't think there's enough evidence to support that that explanation is not real. I would think what's much more likely is that the audience who doesn't accept it as real is having the same mentality as Anderson, where they have built an identity as the people trying to figure out Sherlock's death, and if it is explained to them, then they are no longer the people trying to figure out Sherlock's death, so they don't know who they are, so they can't accept the explanation even when it's handed to them by the person who did the deed.
That is a very concise way of explaining what happened, right? The other thing that like we said before, these readers are in tension with the story itself, like the actual text, like they are in tension with what is present in the reality of the text. And this is exactly as you say. They get provided the answer, they reject the answer, and they stick with their existing reading. I want to talk a little bit about like what this means online and the impact this has. Something worth noting at this time, so around 2014, this is where you start to get dedicated blogs for specific metas. For those who weren't on Tumblr at the time, basically you'd have your main blog, which was generally your like public-facing persona. You would usually have some kind of a personal blog that was semi-private. Then you have alt blogs that cover specific topics. And so an alt blog in this case would be like my, John Locke blog, or my, Sherlock and Molly romance blog kind of thing. But what's really interesting that's happening at the time is a lot of readers have started to push back on the queer reading of the text, identifying the queer baiting is present. Like there's quite a lot of, particularly given Mary's inclusion, right? This episode really solidifies for a lot of audience that, this is defeating the is John gay question by giving him a fiance, right? In order to explain what happens next, there's an aspect of Tumblr that I think is worth trying to explain, which is that at the time, Tumblr was very asynchronous. It's a little different than modern social media, where modern social media is very instantaneous and reactive, right? Given the rise of video content and how easy it is to produce and consume now, it was a lot harder back then to make content that was consumable. And particularly video content was really expensive to make. So instead, text posts tended to be the primary form of engagement. And a really key aspect of that is the way that Tumblr conversations worked is somebody would post something, you would reblog it to your blog and then add your thoughts to it. They would get notified and then they could repost it to their blog and vice versa. And so what you ended up with was this kind of asynchronous communication. And so one of the key tools for that we've already discussed is the question function of Tumblr. So another user could go onto your blog and send you a question, and that could either be anonymous or from their blog. But the thing that was happening is a lot of these fandoms were spread out geographically. So, there were a lot of people in England and Australia and America, and so time zones were a thing. And so there were scenarios where, depending on the timing of a question, you may not see it for 2 days before replying. The other aspect is that when people reblog your content and add their own notes, there's also a chance you'd miss it entirely, because if somebody else then reblogged that and commented that and someone else reblogged it, you could kind of get 20 to 30 notifications per day in a chain. And it would be really easy to get these out of sync in such a way that you would just miss like discourse happening about something you said, or you'd miss like a claim that someone made, and then you'd respond to someone else who was responding to a claim made about you. And then you'd only find out what was happening weeks later. And so this disconnect introduces a really curious artifact at the time, where someone's thoughts on a particular Sherlock scene could go viral, and they would have no idea that had happened. Like, you could say something, and it could become like the big theory, and you wouldn't know for like a week. I mention this because, whereas now if this happens, you would immediately try and take advantage of that success, and you would galvanize it and try and make some money off of it and use that clout to sell something or whatever. Like, that's what happens now. People get like 5 minutes of fame and they try and spin it into an influencer career. Because the mode of communication is far less reactive, people would often end up spending a lot of time crafting a response, right? They would spend hours and hours writing out these thoughts and feelings. And one of the interactions I want to step you through of it's sort of the reaction to this season and its fallout should hopefully paint a picture to answer a question you asked before about like why are why are users reading this text in this way and becoming so exclusionary? Like, why are they saying like, no, my headcanon is the one that matters. If you don't believe it, you're not part of this space. So I want to try and break apart for you why that's happening. So This comes from Tumblr user Inevitably Johnlocked, who we visited before. And the question is sent to Inevitably Johnlocked from Tumblr user, the gender binary is a lie. So quote, "Hi, yesterday I got myself into a discussion with some non-believers of a feminist aware kind, whose main argument against Johnlock seemed to be that it's 2016, we can request representation in more than just subtext. They made me feel not only like a queer-baited fool, but also like I put myself down by being happy with the representation just being in subtext. This kept me up at night, and I would like someone else's thoughts on it. Also, do you ever think we will get to hear them say out loud, I'm gay/bi?" End quote. So this user is saying, like, and keep in mind this is 2 years after this episode, but it's specifically in response to a conversation being had on this blog about Mary and about this canon explanation of what happened. This idea that 2 years after this episode comes out, people are very much like, this show is queer baiting, it's not interested in representation, but people still holding on to it. So the response is followed, and I'll try and break this out for you in little chunks. Quote, "I know the argument is old, but it is still valid. Ask these people one thing. If one or other of the protagonists was a woman, is it subtext then? There'd be no mistaking that John or Sherlock were openly flirting with one another. There's no subtext in that, at least. The flirting is only subtext because some homophobic asshats are insisting on the series being a bromance. Mark Gaddis, a gay man who is actively involved in supporting the rights of LGBTIQ plus people and positive portrayals of LGBTIQ plus characters in the media, would not just queerbait. And Stephen Moffat, who has openly gay and bi characters in his other show, Doctor Who, and he is so hard up on being the one to make these classic characters be together. And their favorite adaptation of Sherlock Holmes is The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, a movie that the writer, Billy Wilder, has openly come out to say that his Holmes was gay, but because of the laws in the time period, he just couldn't do that. In this day and age, to say that a show which has so much queer coding will eventually lead to nothing is ridiculous. There is a long game at work here, and I honestly think this is some of the most brilliant storytelling I've ever come across." End quote. You got to have a lot of empathy for these people, man, because like that is such a, looking at the paratext and like trying to draw together, like, yeah, to be like, well, do you really think this is going nowhere? I mean, at best, this is a pretty naive way of reading the text. And at worst, I think it's probably a little bit closed-minded to my mind as well. These spaces create themselves in reaction to marginalization, right? People, particularly at the time online, people would say, "Oh, well, we don't want gay characters in our show," for example. And what these spaces would do is they would react to that marginalization and create a space. An example of what I mean by this is they're deliberately reading against the text. The quote I want to pull out there is, quote, "Ask these people one thing. If one or the other main protagonists were a woman, is it subtext then? There'd be no mistaking that Sherlock and John were openly flirting with one another," quote. And this is oddly self-defeating and ironic, because if the genders were reversed or if one or the other was a woman, this is the exact scenario of the show Elementary. Like, Joan Watson is a woman, and there is no sexual tension or implication between them. It's just banter. And so it's one of those arguments that like defeats itself because there is an example happening at the time where those genders are changed and there's no subtext of romance. And I'll talk about like, I guess the way that this develops into, this is my meta. If you don't believe in it, you're wrong. Like the exact thing that you were asking about before. But just having laid that out, what are your thoughts and reaction to that take? Like, what wheels are spinning in your head as a result of kind of hearing that historical context?
I mean, I definitely agree with what you said, that it, like the people who are writing these things, we definitely need to empathize with them, that they are feeling hurt, that the representation that they want to see is not what they are getting. And even worse, they thought they were getting that representation, and yet it was flipped on its head. Now, having said that, I think so much of what this person is talking about is their own inferences and their own headcanon that is not supported by the text. I do not think that it was queerbaiting whatsoever. I do not think that there is flirting going on between those two characters, no matter what sex they are. Look at the text. I do not see that that is flirting, except that everyone tends to have their own basis level of what they consider flirting to be. And it kind of feels like this person considers flirting to just be like general talking and having, like, if you talk about your feelings to someone, is that flirting? Well, to this person, maybe it is.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe talking so openly as John and Sherlock occasionally do, maybe they consider that flirting, because to them a relationship is not something that is that open. So if it's that open, then it must be flirting.
Yeah,
I don't see anything that they do.
No, neither. A part of me agrees with what you're saying, and I think a lot of the time it's like, because these are kids online, right? Like, they don't have a lot of experience yet with this stuff, or they're still working it out as teenagers, and so they might be interpreting different things. Because I look at that and I'm like, they're not flirting. Like, those two characters don't flirt. The show queer baits them by having other people constantly call them gay, but they don't flirt to my view. The one thing I do want to really be clear about, though, is that something that's happening here is this strong definition of in-groups and out-groups. At the end of this question, I want to read you something that happens, which I think is really, really fascinating, especially because you weren't online at the time. So they end their thought with this. There's a really long response. They end it with this, quote, "Do not feel ashamed. You're amazing and beautiful. These acquaintances of yours are toxic to your mental health. Please be safe. Personally, I don't think you should associate with them anymore if this is a common occurrence, them making you feel like this. Please," and this goes for everyone, "never hesitate to PM me anything in the chat. I don't want you to ever feel like you are not important. I think you're important, and it only takes just one person." End quote. And so you can feel the tension between the subject matter of, hey, we're a marginalized group, we identify with this, and then the gatekeeping, right? You're amazing and beautiful, contrasted with, I don't think you should associate with them anymore. Now, I don't think on paper that cutting toxic people from your life is necessarily crucial or not crucial. Your mileage is going to vary. But this maneuver isn't that. This is the question asker, in my mind, saying, they don't get you, but we do. So you should stop talking to them and be just stay here with us. Like, stay here in this. This is a safe space for you. We all agree with you. And this is a really common Tumblr maneuver. So to your point before about, like, why are people so adamant about this headcanon? It's because in this space, the context of the content of the text and your interpretation of the text is used as a exclusionary maneuver for social groups, right? So as we've said before, the social is predicated on its exclusions. This is that in action, right? Metas function in the same way as MySpace groups or cliques in high school or like World of Warcraft guilds. The social has to define itself by who isn't in the social. As an obvious example, like, you can tell from that post and the way it ends, the idea that most readers identify, the fact that most readers by this point in 2016, so 2 years after this episode, most readers can identify that Sherlock is a text that queer baits its readers. Like, that's obvious to a lot of people at that point. However, what this Tumblr user is doing by saying something like, I don't think you should associate with them anymore, they are defining their social by its exclusion, literally. They're saying, if you don't agree with this reading, you're not part of us, or if you believe the text is queer baiting, you're not part of us and you're toxic. And so this kind of mode of social presumes that social is binary, right? You're either with us or you're not. We know as adults in real life, it's a lot more complicated than that. Like, the social is permeable and changes and grows and evolves. It is less binary than that, but obviously it is always defined by its exclusions, right? The people that we have as friends, we often trick ourselves into thinking that we have friends because we have these interests in common, which is always true. But the way that you define that is by people that don't have that interest in common. So I'll give you a really easy example. If we talk about high school cliques for a second. So where and when I grew up, it wasn't cool to be into books and computer games and things like that. You had to be into sports. That was the main thing. You had to be into sport, and you had to be really, really good at it. And so me and my friends kind of gravitated toward each other because we didn't play sport or fit into those cliques. We were kind of like naturally marginalized by those interests. Now, we did have things in common, which is like, we liked video games and we liked these things. But our social, small as it was necessarily predicated on the exclusion of everyone else. An easy example is that I'm a huge book nerd and writer, and like none of my friends in high school wrote that much or read that much. Like, but we were still friends because we had defined ourselves by what we weren't, which was we weren't the jocks who were good at sport. We weren't the kids who, were, these like no life, burnouts. Like we weren't those kids. But the crucial thing to understand about this, and I guess where Tumblr pushes back on reality, is that in reality, this group membrane is like permeable. Like it's not linear like this Tumblr user wants to present it as. It's not like if you think the show is queerbaiting, you're toxic. That's not how it works. One of my closest friends was in one of the sporty cliques, but he was also friends with us. And so, yes, there was a division phenomenologically between us, but he was able to interact with both groups. Rather than both of us accepting him as a member, he was always one of them in their eyes. Like for their group, he was one of them, but he was always a guest to our group. He could come in and out when he needed to. And so to say that it is binary, I think is like really a particular type of maneuver. It is trying to isolate people from others in the community in order to kind of generate buy-in. It's like if you've been in a really toxic relationship where, think of pretty much every woman has probably experienced this if they've dated men before. But, think of men that who will say, oh, your friends suck. They don't really mean the best for you, that they're using you or whatever. Now, that is sometimes true, but it's also a maneuver. It's an isolating maneuver. And so what's really fascinating to me is you have all of these theories about socialization getting solidified and like codified in the Tumblr ecology. Certain fandoms are committing to John Locke, as we just talked about. Other ones are committing to Moriarty coming back and they're constructing signs. Others want Sherlock and Molly to get together. And if you don't believe in the evidence that they believe in, they will actively eject you from the community or say, well, you don't get it because you're not one of us. Does that, I guess to answer your question before, does that give you an idea of like why this stuff becomes so like, why it's like if you don't like, you're saying before like, well, why can't people just be happy that I believe it and it's fine and it doesn't have to affect someone else's reading? Does that kind of clarify a little bit about what's happening historically as to why these become so adamant and galvanized?
Yeah, one of the bigger questions that I had about it though was why they are defining this show so much based around the characters' relationships, the characters' romantic relationship and the characters' perceived sexuality. Like, this is not a love story. Pick any movie that's a love story and that entire, the entire plot is about the character's romantic interest and the character's sexuality. That is vitally important to the story. You can't have a love story between two characters if you don't understand their sexual preferences, whatever. Mm-hmm. But that's not the point of this. These are murder mysteries that tend more towards character studies, but it's still, it's only like tangentially about the relationship that John and Sherlock have. You could almost cut that out and still have the same basic story where someone gets murdered. They're trying to figure out who murdered them and solve the thing. So I don't understand why they are, all these folks on Tumblr are focusing so hard. The story is not defined by the character's preferences, but they're making. Yeah.
I think it goes back to what we talked about before with Death of the Author. But what these guys are doing instead is, instead of Death of the Author, where they're like the author has no sway over this text, they are mystifying. There is a mystification of the authorial function, right? A lot of these meta readers they so mystify the function that you've heard about the way they talk about it. They talk about these writers as these like omniscient geniuses with this plan at every turn. They I don't know how else to explain it other than they dissolve the process of writing script and text into this like magical operant function where like writers like cast they cast a spell over the text instead of and what they're doing is the tension they're experiencing with the reality of the text and the mystification that they're performing of how like creating a story works. I think results in these people who so desperately want to see themselves represented in media that they, consciously or not, have chosen to misunderstand how stories are created in order to provide themselves the mental space to anticipate that representation. It's like I so badly want to see this type of character represented because I feel I associate with that kind of character. I've been marginalized for being this type of way, and I feel targeted for this type of way. It's easier to mystify the authorial function and suggest that there is some bigger thing at play than it is to accept the reality that like these writers just aren't that interested in exactly what you're saying. This text is not about that stuff. I think it's a mode of coping with reality. It's a coping mechanism, and they're encouraging each other to participate in this coping mechanism because there isn't that representation. And then they double down on it, and they encourage each other to double down into these it's sort of, it's an adolescent desire to manipulate reality into what you want it to be. Like they're twisting the fabric of reality into what they want. And it's like we've talked about with conspiracy theorists and like QAnon and things like that. It's the same flattening of the complexity of reality into a series of simple doctrines, which is like Sherlock and John are gay, and we will all evidence we will warp to fit that, because that's a more comfortable conclusion than these writers, while they have some support and some representation of LGBTIQ plus characters, this is not a show that's interested in that. The show is not about romance. And also, these writers really don't do representation that well. If you look at Doctor Who and Stephen Moffat, it's kind of embarrassing to look at. He repeats the same sort of mistakes, right? And so, you know, one of the common phrases they use that I think perfectly crystallizes what I'm trying to explain is they will say stuff like, you don't really believe that Moffat/Gaddis would do XYZ without a plan or without meaning something. And that idea of you don't really believe, that's that's the mystification of the author function. The idea that you could read a scene and instead of, like we've been doing this whole time, be like, that just seems like an unforced error, or we think the writers were going for this, but clearly they missed the mark. Or we go, we have no idea why this is here. This is really weird. Instead of that, you go, well, no, everything is part of the plan, and the plan is this outcome I've already predetermined because I so desperately need that representation. And that must be a really difficult position to be in. And it opens these people up to being kind of drawn into these exclusionary sort of toxic spaces where you're vulnerable to people saying, oh, like, you know, your other friends are toxic because they think the show is queer baiting. You should be one of us where we believe this is true. And it's that, you know, in other spaces you would call that like a radicalization process. In this space, I think it's people being drawn further and further from the reality of the text. And, you know, for the other thing to keep in mind is that the authors of the text keep promising this is a deep genius level mystery, and there's a rug pull that's going to come, and so they're being told by the people they're surrounded by, who are insulating them against people that disagree with them, right? They are. It's the same way that, you know, people who believe in QAnon will be distanced from their families and things like that. They are distanced from the reality of the text. They are being told by the people who are writing it that there is some great rug pull that's coming to happen, and it's going to turn out to be the show made sense the whole time. And so they end up existing in this like limbo where they are unable to break like that tension with the text and reality. They're unable to fully break that tension and realize like, oh no, the show's just bad. But they're also unable to be pulled back from that and reassess the reality of the text because they're being further and further insulated. And so it seems to me that it comes from this deep kind of natural desire to be represented, and then just being kind of fed this weird, narrow, adolescent, escalatory, like kind of isolationist thing. And you just kind of get stuck in this pipeline. And before you know it, you know, you're writing fan fiction and metas, and you're calling people's friends toxic, even though like that person's trying to help you and be like, hey, this show is never going to give you the representation you want. They're trying to be empathetic and helpful, and you're being told that that's actually toxic behavior.
Another way to look at their dedication to interpreting things a certain way, and the way that they look at the creators as these like perfect deities is it's kind of something I've talked about before about how when we really love something and we consume a whole bunch of it and we watch the same the same things over and over and over because we love it so much, we need to firmly believe that the creators are 100% in control of this thing that we love so deeply. So we will, like, you see this so much in Star Wars where people think George Lucas is like this uber brilliant person and has like 15 pages of backstory written on every single little detail that he has, when in fact half of the time when you look at the behind the scenes stuff, he's like, oh yeah, I think that would be a neat idea, let's do that. And then you have the actual writers who are like, George, that's not going to fit with 15 other ideas that don't fit with that.
He's like,
so yeah. So it's like the audience members just, we cannot accept that the story that we love isn't perfect, and therefore the creator of that story must be perfect. So like I see so much of that in the explanation. Like, yeah, they may be, these people writing on Tumblr may be looking for equal representation, but they're also looking for the justification, for the vindication that what the effort they are putting forth, that the writers are also putting forth.
Yes.
So that they can continue to love this thing. Representation aside, it's just they need to know the writers are in control and they're doing what they're, what they perceive to be the best thing, even though that's the writers are just literally there for a paycheck. I mean, like, we never see that, Yeah,
you're exactly right. And so, when I talk about that idea of the mystification of the function, you've explained it perfectly. It's abstracting the fact that, like, this is a show written by people. People make mistakes. People do careless things. People turn up to work hungover and they half-ass a day. Like, there are just a lot of factors at play here that are completely dissolved and obscured into, Moffat and Gaddis are these demigods who have this plan. I think Lucas is a really good analog there, where a lot of people forget that Lucas doesn't really care about continuity. He cares about what's going to be fun and interesting on the day. One of my favorite things is watching the behind the scenes stuff with Dave Filoni during the Clone Wars, and just listening to the tension between, he'll be like, oh, George came up to us and pitched us this idea for an episode. And I had to say, oh, George, you can't do that because, this reason in Star Wars. And George would be like, don't be silly. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, one of the ones that I always stands out to me is there's an episode where Anakin goes to Mustafar in the Clone Wars. And Filoni's like, George, we can't do that because, he goes to Mustafar in Revenge of the Sith. And George is like, it's a mining planet. He can have been there before. You're being ridiculous. And so there's an extent to which I think that's the perfect embodiment. There are authors who will pay that attention, and don't get me wrong, there are writers out there who do this, right? Dan Harmon, Patrick Rothfuss, Neil Gaiman, like, these writers exist. They're out there doing it, but they are very, very few and far between. And I think we often mistake success, and in this case, successful aesthetic, with successful writing, or with, like, deliberate and deterministic writing. Let's try and wrap out this episode because there's literally 2 scenes left. One of my favorite moments.
It's only 3.5 hours. Only 3.5 hours we've been going.
I think our longest one was like nearly 4, right? I think.
We might break it.
Yeah. Trust me, the final episode of season 4, boy, I'm worried about how long that's going to be. Okay, so Sherlock, John, Mary, Mrs. Hudson, and Lestrade are in 221B talking. Molly enters with her boyfriend Tom, who is dressed a lot like Sherlock. It's very weird. Sherlock prepares to go outside to talk to the press, and talks to John about his kidnapping, saying he doesn't know, like, who took him. Sherlock doesn't tell John how he faked his death, and John tells him about the speech he made at his grave. Sherlock then goes outside to talk to the press, but in the tag, somewhere in a dark room, someone is watching footage of Sherlock rescue John from the bonfire. So that's kind of our little coda at the end here. Like we said earlier, John's kidnapping just turns out to be a loose end that's playing into this bigger plot. This, for me, is a classic Moffat tag where there is valuable script and page space taken up with this bonfire sequence. that is all in service of setting up the next thing in the plot instead of focusing on the story you're telling. This is very much like the Missy cutaways from Doctor Who, season 7, I think it is, where like 4 or 5 pages of every script is taken up with this ending sequence. This feels like that maneuver again. I've talked about it to death. I'm not going to relitigate it here. Just unnecessary. Don't need it. You could have got rid of the bonfire, done something else with that sequence, and then just had this guy watching footage of, of Sherlock doing this press conference from an angle that isn't the media. Maybe from like a video camera, being operated by someone else in a different. There's just so many different ways to do this that aren't this. But yeah, that's how this episode resolves. We kind of get our first hint of our series villain here,
which is really interesting once you kind of slow down and look at the room that he's in, because it's so esoteric. Like I'm looking at a shot of a marble bowl filled with tangerines and a doll's head.
Okay.
Yeah, like just slowly scroll through this scene. There's a rabbit and a top hat, so some reference to magic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a weird clown thing standing on top of a head with its tongue sticking out, and then you see all of these file folders, really really old, with notes written on the file folders, and you get hints at what we're looking at, because everything in here looks just really really old, but also well organized and well labeled.
That's interesting. Okay. Okay, knowing where this goes, that's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Although my OCD is annoyed because the labels are not exactly level, and all of the different notebooks that I see, they're kind of haphazardly put on there. But I'm like, let me in there, let me organize. But I don't think it works like that.
No, it does not. Yeah, interesting. Good foreshadowing. We won't say what that is, but let's just say maybe that's like hinting at a little bit of something's going to happen at the end of the season. Listen, this episode for me, the ending here is a little bit clumsy, but I think it's fine. Do you have any other thoughts here that we should talk about before we round out?
One thing I noticed as I was just scrubbing back through was I might give the actor credit for this, because it happens too consistently, and the writers just have not been consistent. But as John and Sherlock are wrapping up their end conversation, John is standing at like perfect military attention with his hands behind his back, and I love every time he does that, because it fits his character. But like I said, they break his military character so often, I don't know if the writers are having him do that, or if the actor is just like, I know this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I just wish they could get his dialogue and his actual character to act like the military man he's supposed to be, but we've already harped on that. Yeah, the ending is kind of interesting, because they have the same thing so many times. It's like a trope of Sherlock, that you'll cut to an ending mystery that introduces a future mystery for the next episode, and it won't have anything to do with your current episode, although this one actually does, because it's a flashback to the fire pit thing.
But that had nothing to do with the episode.
We had that.
So yeah. It I mean it's the whole. I've talked about it to death. It's the Moffat tag problem, where it's like when you resolve something, you must necessarily resolve it with a new mystery. Yeah. Which is very much a result of Lost and that era of TV, which we'll talk a little bit about. Probably episode 3 of this season is what I'm thinking, because that has the biggest Lost ending moment of all time. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of this season. Look, I mean, those are all my thoughts. This episode, I thought it probably has a lot more of the kind of clumsiness that we're going to start to see in it. But I like Molly. I like Mary. I like a lot of the chemistry here. Yeah.
It's one really interesting note that I don't know if you picked up on. Did you notice anything weird in their final now that I think we're both assuming that it was real when Anderson was interviewing Sherlock, based on how they played it off. Did you notice anything odd about their verbal interaction?
No.
Sherlock calls him Philip. He does not call him Anderson.
That's interesting.
He changed. He knows this is a different person, and so he changes how he refers to him.
Is that him knowing it's a different person, or is that him growing? Because he calls Lestrade Greg as well. I thought that was a sign of character growth.
Well, no, he calls him like Gary or something. So he tried, but he didn't get it right.
Oh, okay. I must have missed that. I'm pretty sure he calls him Greg.
I'm almost positive. I'll review that and see. But yeah, I just thought that was so interesting that assuming he is there because he wants to let Anderson let go of his guilt, and then he does not refer to him, like the last name was demeaning. Like that was supposed to be part of it, I think. Although maybe that's a work thing over there. I'm not really sure. Maybe you just call people by last names and that's normal. But the name change was symbolic. What it was symbolic of, I don't know, but it was just interesting to note.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah. I think at the very least, Sherlock has remembered everybody's first names, which is good. He's growing as a person.
Yeah. Although he's like me and he just doesn't remember. He knows it starts with a G and he's just not sure if it's Greg or Gary or...
Yeah, it's a girl or something. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've Mary, Molly, whoever.
That's M's. Next episode will be episode 2 of season 3, which is The Sign of 3. This is our kind of big turning point, I guess, tonally of what this show is doing. And yeah, it's our first like real... Well, that's not true. Episode 2 of last season was a filler episode as well. So this will be cool and good and not boring to watch. So I'm excited about that. Definitely not dreading it.
Where's your sarcasm sign? You're supposed to have one now.
I need like a horn or something. Look, if you enjoyed this, please consider telling a friend you think might like it. We realize this is a very specific sort of thing we do. Otherwise, you can support us at patreon.com/zeroindent. Even $1 a month helps greatly. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Darth, is there anything you want to plug? Anything you got coming up? Any big projects? Anything you want to point people to?
No. I have no idea when I'll actually release this on my channel, but I'm still... The next big video I want to get out is a review of Kylo Ren's backstory, which will be the third of the main characters that I'll finally get around to covering. And then I think I'm going to go and combine all 3 of them into one massive 6-hour video, because I've realized you could recycle content, and it's yeah.
Yeah, smart. Look, that's going to do it for this week. Go check it out. If you just YouTube Darth, you should find all of that great content. Otherwise, yeah, we'll catch you guys next episode for The Sign of 3. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about, I guess, some of the more prescient, I guess, like context historically, maybe a bit about like what TV was doing at the time as well. So we'll catch you guys then.